Muy buenos días y bienvenidos a Un Mejor Plan, Simposio sobre el futuro fiscal de Puerto Rico.
To a better plan, a symposium on the fiscal future of Puerto Rico, of the Fiscal Oversight and Management Board for Puerto Rico.
Symposium on Puerto Rico's fiscal future, budget tools, principles, and state practices. Please welcome to the stage Robert F. Mojica, Jr., the Executive Director of the Financial Oversight and Management Board for Puerto Rico. Demos la bienvenida a Robert Mojica, Jr., el Director Ejecutivo de la Junta de Supervisión y Administración Financiera para Puerto Rico.
Buenos días y bienvenidos. Welcome. I want to thank you all for attending this symposium. It's a discussion about critical issues that every government has had to have and that Puerto Rico is having now. It's a discussion about the integrity, the efficiency, and the transparency of a process that determines how we develop budgets. A little feedback here. Okay. We have budget directors of 5 U.S. states in Puerto Rico today to discuss their experiences with the building blocks of a successful budget process. These are people who focus every day on the fundamentals, how to forecast budgets honestly, how to build reserves against uncertainty, how to plan for capital investments strategically, and make reforms stick across administrations. Puerto Rico is focusing on these same priorities now, including something more basic, establishing a statutory budget framework that most governments take for granted. The symposium brings together people who have done it, who practice it, and they're going to share what works. On behalf of the Financial Oversight and Management Board for Puerto Rico, it is a pleasure to welcome all of you here in the audience and for those joining us on the live stream. For a better plan, a symposium for Puerto Rico's fiscal future. I want to thank the 5 budget directors from Illinois, Ohio, North Dakota, New Mexico, and Utah for joining us today. On tax day, a critical day for every budget director. Some of you have just completed the process of formulating your state's next budget, so it's great to have you all here. Thank you. And a very big special thank you to NASBO, the National Association of State Budget Officers, and particularly Shelby Kearns, whose partnership has been instrumental in making this symposium possible. We are grateful for the government of Puerto Rico for their partnership in making today possible, and welcome to Governor Jennifer Gonzalez Colon, OMB Director Orlando Rivera Berrios, and Treasury Secretary Angela Pantoja Rodriguez, and Francisco Dominic, Secretary to the Governor. Thank you for being part of this today. We organized this symposium to support the government of Puerto Rico and the executive and the legislative branches in strengthening fiscal planning and budget processes through the exchange of practical experience and best practices. Why is that important, and why are we doing this now? Because Puerto Rico is at a turning point, and is what Puerto Rico does next will determine whether this movement leads to lasting recovery. Only 4 years ago, Puerto Rico emerged from the largest public sector bankruptcy in American history. The restructuring of the Commonwealth's debt under Promesa was completed in 2022, and it was a historic achievement. It reduced the debt burden by 50%. It eliminated the threat of bondholder litigation that had paralyzed the government's operation for years, and it created a fiscal space for Puerto Rico to begin rebuilding its finances and form a sustainable foundation. But debt restructuring is not fiscal recovery. It is the precondition for fiscal recovery. Puerto Rico was spending nearly 30% of every tax dollar on debt service, a burden that was unaffordable and unsustainable. The work of Promesa is not finished when the debt is restructured. It is finished when Puerto Rico has demonstrated 4 consecutive balanced budgets under modified accrual and has regained access to the credit markets at reasonable rates. That is the statutory standard. Puerto Rico has not met it yet, but there is progress. The outside world, rating agencies, institutional investors, federal oversight bodies, businesses that want to invest in Puerto Rico, and the broader municipal market are all watching Puerto Rico carefully. And they are asking a specific question: has Puerto Rico changed, or has it restructured the debt only to return to the fiscal behaviors of previous administrations that caused the crisis in the first place? Chronic deficits, one-time fixes, over-optimistic revenue forecasts, deferred obligations, and spending decisions that were made without regard for the long-term structural consequences. The answer that Puerto Rico gives to that question through its actions and not just words will determine whether it regains access on sustainable terms or whether it misses the opportunity that the debt restructuring has made possible. I want to be clear. The work is already underway. We are working with the governor and her administration on a number of these reforms right now. And we have begun conversations with the legislature about the need for a permanent statutory framework, because lasting reform requires that the branches work together. The partnership between the Oversight Board, the governor, and the legislature is what will make these reforms stick. Not just for this administration, but for every administration that follows. So the dialogue that we are having today, the best practices that we will be discussing today, the solutions that we will explore today, these are important elements of advancing more sustainable and effective budgeting practices as part of Puerto Rico's ongoing fiscal transformation. Now let's get to work, and thank you very much.
Thank you, Robert. Now please welcome the Governor of Puerto Rico, the Honorable Jennifer González Colón.
Good morning, everyone. I want to say thank you and welcome to Puerto Rico. And I want to thank the Oversight Board, Executive Director Robert Mojica, and the National Association of State Budget Officers for literally having us and partnering in making this symposium a reality. I really appreciate that. I don't recall this has happened before. So I want to say thank you, because that means a game changer in the discussion on what Puerto Rico is doing and what we can do, copying and modeling new best practices. I also want to thank and welcome our distinguished guests from NASBO who have joined us today, and your willingness to share your experience, lessons, and opportunities is exactly what the government of Puerto Rico wants as a collaboration. As you know, Puerto Rico emerged from the largest public sector bankruptcy in American history in 2022. And we are already doing budget-wise changes, and this is the reason we are here to talk about. But I want to say as well, thank you to John Nixon, a member of the Oversight Board, that actually talked to me about this symposium many, many months ago. Thank you for making this a reality. I also want to thank people coming from New Mexico, Utah, Illinois, Ohio, and North Dakota for making this a reality as well. Your experience and best practices are going to be really studied here and see what we can copy from those lessons. So we really appreciate you traveling in a good weather to Puerto Rico to make this happen. The Foundation for Fiscal Discipline, I think it's important to discuss. 10 years ago, talking about fiscal stability in Puerto Rico sounded like a very distant goal. Today is a reality we are building with fiscal discipline and focus. We have been working in a collaborative way with the Oversight Board, achieving the first certified balanced budget since the enactment of PROMESA in 2016. So it's been long years of the Oversight board here on the island, but actually last year was the first certified balance. And our expectation is to continue to work with the oversight board to make this year the second balanced budget being certified by the board. And this happened because of the real fiscal discipline. And because from day one, my administration has been committed to doing things in a fiscally responsive manner. I also want to speak about the tangible examples of fiscal discipline about what we did in the just 15 months we've been in office. We have achieved an historic reduction of over $900 million in government contract spending, setting a new standard of efficiency and transparency in our local government administration. It's not that we just got 100, 200, 300, almost $1 billion in 1 year. That is a measurable reality that we did, and we will continue to revise all those services and contracts from the government. Those significant savings are the result of a fiscal discipline never seen before, driven by the Executive Order 2025-008 and the OMB Circular Letter 006-2025, which gave us the tools and visibility to centrally oversee public spending. The cost reduction in professional services contracts and a better alignment of spending with the certified budget have allowed government resources to be allocated to initiatives that provide real and immediate support to our people, such as increased funding for special education programs, road improvement, and landslide mitigation, while also strengthening a budget contingency fund. And I will tell you this. We usually have the agencies going to the House and the Senate requesting funds, but there are a lot of changes and what are the priorities for this administration. One of those are going to be infrastructure. So we're going to be seeing a lot of changes in that area. Working with the elderly people in the Department of Education, those are priorities as well as healthcare. So first, we issued Executive Order 2025-011, creating an interagency budget development committee, integrating the agencies responsible for revenue projections, macroeconomic analysis, and fiscal planning. Before that process was very fragmented, which each agency working on its own. Today, we're working in a coordinated manner, and that allowed the OMB, local OMB, to develop a comprehensive budget master plan, strengthen our revenue projections, increase our reserve, and above all, make better informed fiscal decisions. Second, we brought order and clarity to the process. OMB implemented in less than a year a clear and uniform budget manual applicable to all local agencies. A manual that incorporates best practices from states like New York, Ohio, and Utah, but adapted them to our reality. Every agency must now justify its budget request with measurable data and matrix, and they are held accountable for such data. Third, we transform how OMB monitors general fund spending. We implemented a data intelligence system, never been on the island before, which allowed the OMB to see on a near daily basis how the general fund budget is being spent, not just to make sure we don't exceed what was appropriated, but to use that real-time information to plan the following year's budget with better data and greater precision. Fourth, we elevated accountability agencies now to report the budget execution on a regular basis in a standardized format, allowing us to detect deviations early and correct curves where needed. And fifth, we began addressing one of our most critical funding sources, federal funding. We are centralizing visibility of federal funding within the OMB and strengthening compliance to ensure that any changes in federal policy do not destabilize our general fund. And if they do, we are positioned to respond quickly as we did during the last year's federal government shutdown. For the first time since the creation of the Oversight Board in 2016, Puerto Rico government is not merely responding to the board's directive on the budget, we are leading the process with them. The collaborative process has resulted in numerous joint working sessions totaling hundreds of hours weekly of collaborative work, producing more deliverables, covering budget and targets, risk and liability analysis, special revenue fund projections, and policy frameworks. This co-leadership model, where the governments drive the budget developed and the oversight plays a supporting capacity building role, is precisely the transition that PROMESA was designed to achieve, and it reflects the maturity of a fiscal institution and the growing confidence that a government can and will manage its finance responsibly and independently once the Oversight Board is gone. We did it with will, with hard work, discipline, and with execution. For this budgetary process, we're still working with the Oversight Board, and our intention is to have the second certified budget during this year. I made a promise to the people of Puerto Rico that we will create the conditions for real, sustained economic development anchored in bringing back manufacturing to Puerto Rico and good-paying jobs. Today, that promise is becoming a reality. Companies like Eli Lilly, Amgen, and many others have made significant commitments to invest and expand their plants in Puerto Rico. This real commitment is about $2.2 billion in new investment and more than 4,000 new jobs committed to manufacturing on the island just in the 2025 alone. And those are direct reflect and result of the fiscal credibility and stability that the government has worked hard to establish and the pro-growth policies that our administration is putting in place. We are also advancing a comprehensive permit reform because attracting investment is not enough. It's doing business here remains unnecessarily complicated. I want to say thank you again for all of you joining us today. The government of Puerto Rico will continue to work with the Oversight Board to achieve those results and the expectations the people of the island wanted. Thank you, and I hope today you can engage in a productive conversation. I saw the people who are going to be speaking here, and we are very eager to see your recommendations. Thank you, and God bless you all.
Thank you, Governor. Now please welcome to the stage Orlando Rivera Berrios, Director of the Office of Management and Budget.
Buenos días a todos. Es un placer.
Everyone, it's a pleasure to be here. Thank to the FOMB and the entire fiscal team of the government of Puerto Rico. As the governor just mentioned, the Office of Management and Budget has implemented great changes in the planning, execution, and monitoring of public expenditures, implementing through a budget manual some best practices. We recognize that we have a long way to go, but that path is already undergone in an advanced way. It's a pleasure to be here with you and to listen from directors of the FOMB from various states. It's going to be favorable for us to understand how they plan and implement those best practices in their state governments. On our part, we acknowledge that there's a budget reform that has to be implemented, but in less here, we have moved in that direction. We've implemented technological tools to monitor public expenditures. We've centralized the applications for contracts from all government entities between the Office of Management and Budget, with the purpose of being able to have visibility to where the resources are being allocated. From the OMB, we are undergoing structural changes in all the planning, always seeking to centralize the macroeconomic assumptions, the revenue forecasts, so that we can keep a balanced budget. As the governor mentioned, The 2026 budget has been certified by the FOMB as balanced, but we're making sure that that budget ends in a balanced way. We have a challenge in making structural changes in the legal framework of the OMB so that we can make these changes permanent. Nevertheless, while that legal framework is built, which we will be submitting at an appropriate time, there are procedures and manuals that don't require changes in the law, but rather the will to implement the changes in less than a year. This is a reality, and it's a fact under this administration in this year that we have started. The 2027 budget has been one in collaboration with the FOMB. Later on, we will be presenting specific issues as to how they're being dealt with and the specific tools that we have been implementing. We have to reinforce in all agencies so that they know the resources that are available that the government has at a consolidated level, not individually agency by agency. And with this in mind, we believe that the 2027 budget will be much more strategic. And to be here today and listen to all the initiatives and best practices that are implemented in various states will be favorable for us to continue improving our budget planning. Thank you to the board, to Jennifer Gonzalez and the Director of AFAF and the Secretary of the Treasury for all of the help they've given us from the beginning, and believing that the will goes beyond just making structural changes in laws, but if we have the will to do things right, we can implement permanent changes. So thank you very much, and we hope you have a wonderful day.
Thank you. We now welcome to the stage the Honorable Ángel Pantoja Rodriguez, Secretary of the Treasury.
Well, good morning, everyone. It's a great pleasure to be here. First and foremost, I still would like to know who I have to talk to for organizing the symposium on April 15th. No, all joking aside, it's a pleasure for me to be here, and this is a continuation basically on the symposium that we had a couple of weeks ago, the Economic Symposium, which also adds to this continued collaboration and effort to transform not only the budgetary process in the government of Puerto Rico, but also how the finances and the fiscal agenda of the government of Puerto Rico is addressed and how we can continue to improve. I think the governor and the OMB director summarized really well what have been the achievements of the government of Puerto Rico to this date, but all the work that needs to be done to continue that transformation. And all that is left for me to say is that you have the full commitment of the Department of the Treasury and myself to continue that collaboration and continue that transformation under the leadership of the governor, Jennifer Gonzalez Colon. So I just want to say thank you for the invitation. I look forward to the recommendations that you may have on how we can continue that transformation going, and please, for the next symposium, maybe not do it on tax day. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Now please welcome John Nixon, board member of the Financial Oversight and Management Board for Puerto Rico.
Ok, muchas gracias por haber venido. Estoy muy agradecido de estar aquí hoy.
I've got about 5 years as member of the board, and this is a vision I've had for 2 or 3 years, a desire to meet here in the island of Enchantment and to bring some experts from the U.S. to come here and have this conversation regarding such an important topic for the people and the future of Puerto Rico. But this is the extent of my Spanish. I'm going to change now to English.
Be here, and I'm so grateful that you would all come today and support this effort. We're excited to have heard from Governor Gonzalez Colon. We appreciate Secretary Domenech being here, Director Rivera, Secretary Pantoja, and we're just really thrilled to have members of the Oversight Board here, our distinguished guests and budget experts from the mainland who I've worked with, and I'm just really excited to have this discussion today. I want to begin my remarks with some personal context because my perspective on this work is shaped by experience, not theory. Okay, I've had the opportunity to serve as a budget director, and I'll talk a little bit about that. Before joining the board several years ago, I was a budget director of the state of Utah, which is a state that had been consistently recognized as one of the best managed states in the country. During that tenure, my tenure there, I had the opportunity of serving as the president of the distinguished NASBO Association, the National Association of State Budget Officers. We have the current president, Alexis Sturm from Illinois, here with us today as well. And during that time, I was recruited to join by Governor Rick Snyder to join his reinvention team in the state of Michigan. Now, moving from Utah to Michigan was like polar opposites. Okay, Michigan as a state was at the bottom of the list. I mean, almost dead last in every economic metric that you could have. The city of bankruptcy of Detroit was facing major financial distress. Ultimately, we took them into bankruptcy, but it was really two opposite ends of the spectrum. The challenges that we were facing in Michigan were real and they were urgent. So when they reached out to see if I'd be willing to move my sweet wife and 6 young kids, yes, seis hijos, to Michigan, I packed up my bags to join that effort. And this is why I share that story. In just 3 years, with the right attitude, the right dedication, the right partnerships with our legislative partners, we were able to propose and pass 4 structurally balanced budgets. We totally reformed the state budget process. We implemented multi-year budgeting to guide decision-making beyond a single fiscal year cycle. And we enacted major tax reform, which is what we need to do in Puerto Rico as well, to align revenues with long-term economic growth. I will be the first to tell you, as you all know, your tax system here is totally messed up and needs some serious work. In any event, in Michigan, we proved that even in a state facing deep, long-standing fiscal challenges, real reform is possible. It's not easy, but it's absolutely possible. And one more important point about the work we did in Michigan. I left the state 12 years ago, even though it seems like it was yesterday. And the platform we built hasn't eroded. It's only strengthened. And over the last decade, the state, even though it switched party controls, has experienced credit rating upgrades and only strengthened financially, which has really led to the opportunity to make strategic investments in education, in infrastructure, in those things that government needs to be there to fund. We had to get the house in order, we had to hit the reset button, and we built the ship all over again. And it's been a very strong state, and Governor Whitmer is very excited about that at this point. This reform and this change is what led me to join the Oversight Board. When they reached out to me to see if I'd be interested in serving, I saw that same opportunity to do that here on this island, and I got really excited about it. I didn't join the Oversight Board to negotiate with creditors and to solve bankruptcies. I joined the Oversight Board to implement true fiscal reform and to help create a baseline to grow from, a place that all Puerto Ricans could experience success and a positive future. You know, in 2016, Puerto Rico entered bankruptcy with $130 billion in debt. Since then, we have completed 12 of the 13 restructurings. We have one that's still out there that you're all very intimately aware of, and I wish we could get that one resolved here quickly. But it's unfortunately aren't really good answers with the PREPA deal. But this is historic progress that we made on the bankruptcy world. But at this point, we need to talk about implementing fiscal reforms and really building that strong baseline so Puerto Rico can grow and flourish into purchase. Over the last several years, I've had the opportunity to work with Shelby Kearns, who was the former budget director for the great state of Idaho, which happens to be my birthplace, so I'm partial to Idaho, about having this forum. I said, Shelby, do you think we could bring some budget directors down to the island to generate a discussion, to share best practices? And Shelby, with her board, some of who are here today, supported that effort, and we're so grateful that they did. It's not to come down to tell Puerto Rico what to do or to tell Puerto Rico what they're doing wrong, but rather to share what they've learned, to share best practices and exchange ideas, and to see how to implement and institutionalize true fiscal reform and how they've done it in the real world. The 5 current budget directors who are here with us today collectively manage budgets over $220 billion and provide services to more than 30 million U.S. citizens. In addition to that, if you add in the experience of Director Mujica, Executive Director Kearns, and myself, that number grows to over 63 million Americans and over $570 billion, so over $500 billion. We have a lot of experience sitting in this room today, and we're so grateful to have that here. So the truth is, Puerto Rico is not alone, right? All the states face similar problems. The question is, and the difference is how these problems are addressed, and that's what we want to talk about today. And Puerto Rico, over decades, has faced persistent financial challenges, in part because of the systems needed to manage those challenges are not in place. And we need to change that starting today. Let me emphasize something that is absolutely critical to the process. This is, and I need Francisco to listen here. I'm glad you're here, Secretary Domenech. This takes strong executive support and leadership, and we're so grateful. I've had numerous conversations with the governor, and I know that she's committed to making a positive difference, and she shares the vision to having a bold and bright Puerto Rico going into the future. And I'm so grateful for her willingness to partner and to move forward in instituting these fiscal reforms. They've already started doing a lot, as you've heard from the budget director and the governor, and we're really excited to partner with her. We also need strong legislative support. We have the chairman of the House Ways and Means Committee. We're so grateful that you would join us today and take time out of your busy work. These are so important, and and if this effort succeeds, it's going to be because of this leadership, but not only at the elected official level and senior administration, it's the people that are actually doing the work that need to have the tools and the resources to be successful. Before I close, let me recognize some of the work of the Financial Oversight Board. When Executive Director Mujica made the decision to leave his post in New York to serve as Executive Director, I was extremely grateful. When we were looking, when Natalie left, I knew we needed a budget director to come in who really understood these fiscal best practices. And I'm really happy and proud of the team we've built, our FOMB team here on the island. We have some of the brightest minds in public finance working on these issues every day, and their experience and commitment has been critical to the progress we've made. But just as important as building this team is ensuring that this knowledge is transferred. We must make sure the Commonwealth, OJP, Hacienda, AFAF, and other institutions have the tools, systems, and expertise to take on all the key responsibilities that the board performs, because that transition is the goal. And I want to be clear, I'm confident in the government team. Our job is to make sure they have the tools needed to succeed. This effort's going to take all of us, government leaders, the legislature, agency teams, the business community, nonprofits, and stakeholders across Puerto Rico, many of you who are here today. This is about embedding these reforms into the DNA of Puerto Rico, making them part of the culture, part of how decisions are made, and part of how government operates every single day. If we do that, we will truly institutionalize these practices. We won't just solve today's challenges. We will create a foundation that benefits future generations to come. And institutionalizing these reforms, Puerto Rico will be in a position to meet the requirements of PROMESA by consistently achieving balanced budgets and regaining access to the credit markets. Which brings me to one of the most important points I can make today. I am fully aware that there are very specific requirements in law that dictate when the board's work is done. But the true measure of success will be whether we are able to implement these structural reforms and create a long-term path for Puerto Rico, one that ensures it never returns to financial insolvency again. That is the goal. Let me close with this. I see a bright future for Puerto Rico, a vibrant, growing economy, a tide that lifts all boats, a place where people have real opportunities to succeed, where children receive a high-quality education and choose to stay here to build careers, raise family, and invest in the communities they call home. A Puerto Rico where the next generation doesn't feel like they have to leave to find opportunity, but instead chooses to stay because of it. This is the future we are working toward, and based on what I've seen in Michigan, Utah, and other states, I know it can be done. Thank you so much for your leadership, your partnership, and your commitment to the future of Puerto Rico. I look forward to the discussion today. Thank you.
Thank you, John. Now please welcome Juan Carlos Blanco, Fiscal Transformation Director at the Financial Oversight and Management Board for Puerto Rico and former Budget Director for Puerto Rico.
Good morning, and thank you for being here today. We're gathered to talk about something that is foundational to Puerto Rico's future, building a responsible, modern, and disciplined budget system that can support long-term prosperity. This is not just a technical discussion for accountants and analysts. Budgets may look like spreadsheets and jargon, but really, they are strategic blueprints that shape every aspect of our daily lives. They determine what we value, what we invest in, and the Puerto Rico that we're building together. Today is about ensuring the work we do now doesn't unravel later. It's about guaranteeing Puerto Rico's future post-PROMESA is stronger than the past. But why is fiscal transformation an imperative? Our fiscal crisis did not happen spontaneously. It resulted from years of inadequate processes and decisions that pushed cost into the future instead of addressing them responsibly. Despite many warnings, eventually we hit a hard wall, a wall made up of $130 billion in unpayable debt. And we had to learn a painful lesson. Without institutional safeguards to plan, manage risks, and live within our means, the system inevitably will break. We've made enormous progress. Debt restructuring lifted a massive burden, but restructuring is not a cure, it's a reset. If we don't institutionalize fiscal responsibility now, we set the clock for the next crisis. Permanent budget transformation is the only path to consistently balanced budgets, restored market confidence, and a government that never repeats the pre-crisis failures that harmed our people. To move forward, we must be clear about what transformation budget is. Some may think it's simply about fiscal controls or checking boxes to end the Oversight Board's mandate. Yes, those things matter, and they matter a lot. But the transformation goes far deeper. It is a fundamental cultural shift. It means moving from survival mode to sustainability mode. Moving from how do we get through this year to how do we thrive for decades. Budget transformation is not a temporary fix or a stack of new reports. It is the modernization of how Puerto Rico plans, allocates, executes, and oversees public funds. It includes informed forecasting, disciplined budgeting, more transparent reporting, multi-year planning, and modern integrated financial system. This transformation does not occur in a vacuum. States across the U.S., including the ones represented here today, face the same challenges and use similar tools to stay ahead of fiscal risk and safeguard sustainability. Our peers face our same struggles, and we can learn from proven models to build a stable foundation for Puerto Rico's future. Then, what is our goal? Responsible fiscal policy is more than balancing next year's budget. It means understanding whether the commitments we make today are sustainable over time. If not, we risk reversing services, investments, and reforms that we care about, especially in moments when temporary surpluses or federal aid create tempting illusions of abundance. The budget cannot simply answer, what do we have today? It must answer, can we afford this 5 years from now or 10 years from now? Building this system takes time, discipline, and commitment. It means creating capacity, adopting systems, reviewing processes, and continuously evaluating performances. And because budgets are not static documents, sustainable systems require the ability to assess outcomes, audit programs, and incorporate lessons learned. This creates a culture of accountability and adaptability, both essential in an ever-changing world. But even as the world changes, the foundations of fiscal responsibility remain constant. In the end, math will always rule. Therefore, we must lay the building blocks of a sustainable post-promesa system, one designed to last. Realistic revenue forecasting is one of those building blocks. Forecasts will never be perfect, but informed realism is far more valuable than wishful thinking. We must also maintain disciplined spending growth, aligned with long-term economic trends like population changes and inflation. Structural deficits arise when spending outruns the economy. And Puerto Rico's economy, like any other economy, has boundaries. Our government must understand the local economy and respect the impact of revenue-generating activities. Another core principle, avoiding short-term fixes that create long-term imbalance. One-time solutions like asset sales or fund transfers or even issuing debt may plug a hole for a year, but create bigger gaps later, and we know really well about that. Recurring revenues must align with recurring expenditures. That is the only way to prevent today's choices from becoming tomorrow's crisis. We must also commit to measuring what matters. Budgets should not just ask, how much are we spending? They should ask, what are we achieving? When funding is tied to outcomes, efficiency and innovation grow, and policymakers can make better decisions rooted in evidence, not tradition or politics. Infrastructure planning is another essential piece. Roads, bridges, schools, and water systems require long-term thinking, rigorous project evaluation, and dedicated funding. Strong capital plan supports economic growth and improves quality of life. These investments are not luxuries. They're part of the backbone of any healthy budget system. And then there are rainy day funds. Economic downturns are inevitable. The question is whether we're prepared. Setting aside funds in good times preserves essential services when times are not, without drastic cuts or tax increases. Strong rules and clear targets are key to making these reserves reliable. All these building blocks must be embedded in our legal framework. Strong financial policies are not technicalities. They are the foundations of good governance. Because policies outlive administrations, they ensure continuity. They prevent us from reinventing solutions every time we face a familiar challenge. This is how our budget process becomes a long-term strategic tool. Puerto Rico now stands at a pivotal moment. Fiscal stability is stronger than it has been in decades. We have a real opportunity to embed practices that protect us from future crises, improve transparency, enable strategic investments, and ensure that public resources achieve measurable results. Oversight from the Fiscal Oversight and Management Board is not meant to be permanent, and it is not a substitute for reform. Our long-term future depends on ownership of this transformation. And why does transformation matter to the average citizen? because responsible fiscal management is about capability. With it, we reclaim our power to make meaningful investments. We can look at a new project and know for certain that we can afford it 5 years from now. We can look at a tax cut and ensure that it will not force us to slash services later. This transformation gives our elected leaders good news. It shows exactly when we can afford to build that new road or expand a health program without threatening our future. The transfer of tools, practices, transparency requirements, and performance frameworks from the board to the government is underway, but maturity requires cultural change, accountability, and capacity building. This is how we ensure the fiscal stability we have fought so hard to regain is never lost again. Let me close by stating that budget transformation is not meant to be easy. It takes discipline and collaboration. It requires changing long-standing habits and expectations. But we know we can do this. Other states have done it, and Puerto Rico has already proven its ability to overcome enormous fiscal challenges. To the key players in government and the public sector here today, this is our opportunity to move from being overseen. This transformation is about our buy-in. It's about building a government capable of sustaining stability long after the board is gone. Today is about taking the next step, from fiscal stress to structural reform, from crisis response to long-term stability. This is a once-in-a-generation opportunity. Let's build together a system worthy of Puerto Rico's future. And let's make sure the progress we achieve today endures post-promesa. Thank you.
Thank you, Juan Carlos. We will now begin our panels and talks. Our first 3 lightning talks are moderated by Shelby Kearns, Executive Director of the National Association of State Budget Officers. Please welcome Shelby, and our first speaker, Alexis Sturham, Director of the Illinois Governor's Office of Management and Budget. They will be discussing capital budgets and financial plans.
Is it on? First, I want to say thank you for inviting us to spend Tax Day in such a beautiful part of our nation and for such a warm welcome to your home. We appreciate it very much. Alexis, as we dive into capital spending, I know the first thing that Governor Pritzker did when he was elected governor and you became budget director was to do a $45 billion capital plan to address capital needs in Illinois. What was that like as a new budget director, and what was the single most important rule that you found that your state follows to ensure that that capital spending stays affordable over the long term?
Great, thank you. Good morning. Yes, in 2019, when Governor Pritzker came into office, it had been about 10 years since we'd passed a significant capital plan, and so that was one of his top priorities when he came into office. We pulled together what we called Rebuild Illinois, really focused on improving our deteriorating infrastructure, a lot of investment in roads, bridges, transit, but really he recognized the importance of a multi-year capital plan to the economic development and the future health of Illinois. One of the most important things that I think that we did is we made sure that it was affordable within the context of our budget. We'd had budget challenges for several years leading up to the governor coming in, and we set aside the revenues that we raised for capital. We did some changes to about 12 different revenue streams, set it aside, did modeling for 5 or 10 years to try to identify what was affordable with that revenue stream, and then did a mix of pay-as-you-go funding and bonded capital that would then be supported by those set-aside revenue streams.
And how do you integrate that capital plan with the operating budget to avoid future structural imbalances?
Sure. One of the things that we have in our statute is that our debt service is limited to 7% of our appropriations from our general fund and our highway funds. And so when we do the modeling on the debt issuance, we do make sure that we're staying within that 7% test. That really helps. We set aside the revenues, and really that is the primary repayment for the debt service, and then there is a backup from the general fund. And so using that to make sure that it's affordable really helps. We also issue our debt all as level principal 25-year bonds, so we have a very rapid amortization schedule.
So this is kind of a tough one. What governance mechanism prevents politically driven projects from bypassing the prioritization criteria?
Sure. Budgets are complicated, and there's a lot of people who have priorities for where those capital dollars are going to go. One thing that we do have in place at Illinois is that all bonded projects and most capital projects have to go through review by the governor's office before the project can move forward. So the agency reviews the project, the governor's budget office reviews the project, and then the governor does as well before that appropriation can be unlocked and used for a project. So that's a really key control for the executive branch. Additionally, we do follow the transportation asset management that's required by the federal government, which uses data analytics to prioritize projects for transportation for both roads, bridges, and transit, so we use that. We also publish quite a bit of documents about our capital projects to make sure that there's transparency about the capital projects the state's funding. We do an annual capital book from the budget office that illustrates kind of our 5 years of looking ahead on capital, and then our transportation agency actually publishes a multi-year plan every year that shows all of the new projects that they're going to start moving forward across the state, both in roads and bridges over the next 5 years.
And with all of that information that you have, what data or metrics do rating agencies look for first when they're evaluating your capital plan?
Sure. Rating agencies, when we've had conversations with them on our capital plan, they're looking at affordability, the debt impact, particularly on the bonded side. They're looking for the legal frameworks to support the repayment of the debt. They are looking at returns on investment. What is this capital project going to do for the long-term economic health of the state? So for us, our priority is maintaining our interstates. We're one of the biggest interstate states. We have a lot of highway miles. So making sure that those are there to support economic development, and that also that we're looking ahead to the future. How are we going to pay back the bonds? What are our plans if the projects end up costing more? There's been a lot of inflation in capital projects in the last decade, so what is the state's plan to cover those shortfalls? All of those are important conversations.
Thank you for this great conversation.
Thank you, Shelby and Alexis. Now it's time for our first panel. This panel focuses on solutions that stick, practical lessons from U.S. states, and how states have approached key budgeting challenges. Joining the discussion, Christina Frass, Assistant Director of the Ohio Office of Budget and Management, Joe Morissette, Director of the North Dakota Office of Management and Budget, and welcome back Alexis Sturham. The Oversight Board's Fiscal Transformation Director, Juan Carlos Blanco, will be moderating this panel. Please welcome them all to the stage.
All right. First of all, thank you. Thank you for being here, and thank you for making yourselves available to have this discussion here on the island. I know that budget directors truly enjoy talking about budgets and you know, sharing your experience. So hopefully this will be not only beneficial for us, but also a good experience for you guys. So I'm going to start with one question for all of you, right? And precisely the purpose of this panel is to talk about solutions that stick. And Puerto Rico is a fairly young jurisdiction. We have, compared to your states and other places, not a very long history, and we're going through some of those growing pains, right? And now we're being forced to take a look and figure out how we're going to move forward and how we're going to create a system that sticks. So from your experience, and Alexis, I'm going to start with you. What is the foundation of a budget system that sticks?
Sure. So as I mentioned, Illinois had some pretty significant budget challenges, starting with the recession in 2001, where we never fully addressed some of the lingering challenges that came out of that recession. And obviously, like everyone in here, we faced significant challenges during the Great Recession in 2009, 2010, and then had some other challenges in 2010 and in the 2010s. And so when the governor came in 2019, really trying to address Illinois' fiscal position and really taking steps to improve our bond rating, we were just one notch above junk status, which is unusual for a state. And how do we go through and really kind of rebuild the fiscal frameworks in Illinois? Really the most important thing was stakeholder buy-in, so both support from the governor, the executive branch, the legislative branch, but also the business community, the think tanks in Illinois who were active in the business community, but also all committed to investing in Illinois and really making sure that economic development came back to Illinois. Having support from a strong executive branch and really a strong budget office makes a big difference, because for the budget process to work well, you have to trust the numbers, the revenue forecasting, the expenditure modeling, and so having confidence in a budget office makes a lot of difference.
Joe, your experience in North Dakota.
Well, thanks, Juan. You know, I think just recognizing that it's hard to be disciplined. I mean, it's hard in our personal lives. It's no different in state government. It's not like, you know, typically money is not squandered or spent foolishly. There's just a lot of really good ways to spend each dollar, and the challenge is not overspending that dollar and going into debt or deficit spending. And so in North Dakota, we've got a very conservative history. We've had a volatile revenue cycle. Always, our economy is tied primarily to energy and agriculture, fluctuates wildly with commodity prices. And so our legislative branch, a long time ago, wanted to protect protect the state budget in times of volatility. And so they put up guardrails that are hard to change. They proposed constitutional changes that were then voted on by the people of North Dakota to make them, I shouldn't say permanent, but you know, semi-permanent, because it would take another vote of the people to change them. And those guardrails really limit our ability to issue bonds for anything but major capital projects. It limits the amount of bonds that we're able to issue based on a percentage of our sales tax revenue. Our sales tax revenues are our major general fund revenue source, and so they tied those two together. And they also forced us to save. They said that for every dollar that we generate from oil taxes, which in some budget periods is more than all of our other revenues combined, but also volatile and also a depleting resource that we can't count on forever. They said for every dollar that we collect there, we should save 30 cents. And they put that in the Constitution, which makes it hard to access. It could be accessed in times of an emergency, but it would take a supermajority vote of the legislature. So they put in guardrails. So I guess that's my point, is that it's hard to be disciplined, ensure that that discipline continues. And so those guardrails were put in place in a way that made them difficult to change.
And hold that thought, because I want to go back to dealing with volatility and the connection to multi-year planning. But before we get there, Christina, I, as a parent of a student of the Ohio State University, before you start, I think I'm legally obligated to say OH.
I owe.
All right. So please share your experience.
So Ohio has a statutory framework for our operating budget. We operate on a biennial budget, 2 years, which is really helpful in kind of more the long-term planning. The statute lays out not only the time frame that agencies are required to submit their budgets, but also the time frame when the governor has to introduce their budget and when it needs to be approved by the General Assembly. But I'll say that the thing that makes it more successful is operating within the framework of the law in collaboration and transparency. The most successful and the most buy-in that we get with budgets is when within the executive agencies, between the Treasury, the Department of Taxation, the Office of Budget and Management, we work on the revenues together, the revenue projections, and very transparently, very openly share those revenue projections with our legislative counterparts in the Legislative Budget Office. They do their own revenue projections, and it doesn't benefit either of us to be very far apart. We share our economic models. This is the model that we selected. These are the variables that we used, and the assumptions that went into our revenue projections. And it really helps us stay on the same page from the beginning. So even if there are policy differences between the executive and legislative branches, there is a common understanding of the available resources and the path forward. And, you know, similarly on the budget side, when it comes to, you know, collaborating with the cabinet agencies, making sure that the requests are in line with the priorities of the governor is really important. So there are not, you know, promises made that then the governor, you know, has to say that we can't afford. So really the collaboration and transparency is very important to sound budgeting.
Thank you for that. I want to go back, Joe, to your point. I think we can all relate about the impact of the volatility of energy prices here on the island. We know we feel it every day. In your case, it has a direct impact on how you plan and how you manage your budget, the resources that you have available. How does multi-year planning factor into dealing with that volatility, and how important is having that long-term vision when you do actually make decisions about how to use your resources?
Yeah, that's a great question. That multi-year plan is so important to kind of keep your eye on the ball long-term, beyond even the current administration or beyond the current legislative leadership, to say that there is a long-term plan that we're striving for. We've had some history in North Dakota of trying to always have a conservative and reasonable revenue forecast in collaboration with the legislature. But because of volatility, there's times when that proves to be, when we far exceed that forecast, and our collections are much greater. You know, if you look at the volatility in oil prices just in the last 6 weeks, you know, they've doubled. And so there's things like that that are just unpredictable. And so we've had surpluses at times that are not, that we should not count as reoccurring, right? That they are a one-time surplus because we exceeded a forecast and we maybe started a budget with a lot of money in the checkbook. And that has at times led to some lack of discipline and some overspending, and using some of that balance for ongoing spending. We're going through a little bit of a correction now, because prior to the last 6 weeks we had fairly low oil prices, and we were looking ahead to what that might mean. And we're trying to do a little bit of a reset in government and say that we need to trim back that level of ongoing spending to be more in line with our ongoing revenues. We haven't deficit spent, but we've had surpluses that were used to supplement our revenues. And we might not get there in this next biennium, depending on what oil prices do, but our long-term strategy is to trim spending back keep it flat over the next we have a biennial budget, so over the next 3 bienniums, and ensure that our ongoing revenues and spending are balanced by 2032. That's the long-term strategy that we laid out. And so it's important when we make changes in the current biennium or in the upcoming biennium that even though we might have some one-time monies there that could be used to focus on what the long-term goal is of bringing those things in line.
Long-term planning helps you keep that discipline that is so necessary. Alexis, I want to go back to you because you have been very open and shared some of the situations, the problems that Illinois has faced like any other state. And you've also referenced that you have a strong legal framework, and you've heard part of our discussion here is one of the things that we want to do here in Puerto Rico is strengthen our legal framework. Can you share with us a specific example on when Illinois has had to make tough decisions, which are part of what budget directors do every day, and you relied on that legal framework to be able to make those decisions?
Sure. One of the strongest tools that we have to ensure a balanced budget is the constitutional provision for the governor's veto power on the appropriation bills. In Illinois, the appropriation bill runs as a standalone piece of legislation separate from any substantive changes, and the governor can either veto the full bill, he can eliminate a line from the budget bill, or he can just reduce a line, so he can reduce it from $1 million to $500,000. And so he can use that tool to bring the budget back into balance. The current governor has not used that often, but we have used that quite a bit over Illinois' history. Additionally, we do impose reserves on the agencies, or holdbacks of appropriations. So we did do that this fiscal year when we saw some of the revenue impacts that were coming from legislation that was changed at the federal level. We did work with all of our agencies to try to reserve and reduce some of our spending plans for the year to bring the budget back into balance.
And Christina, in the case of Ohio, a legal framework is only as good as your ability to enforce it. So in your case, who is the bad guy? Who's responsible for enforcing that legal framework?
Again, it's really about collaboration. So I think, good communication with our legislative partners is really important. The governor gets the first crack at the budget. So we introduce the budget. It is statutorily and constitutionally balanced. Then what the General Assembly, what the legislature does with it after that, like Alexis said, we have veto power. The governor has veto power eventually at the end to ensure that what is passed is balanced. But really, there is a lot of work. Our General Assembly, our legislature has wanted to cut the income tax over the last 20-something years. And it is a lot of collaboration to make sure that that is sustainable and sound. In which increments? Do we eliminate brackets? Do we just reduce across the board? The legislature relies very heavily on the executive agencies, the Department of Taxation, our Office of Budget and Management, to score the legislation that they propose. And it is that back and forth that allows us to be sustainable. We always bring receipts, right? We show the economic models, we show our projections, and are very honest with what we think can be afforded. And so I wouldn't say there's one hammer, but I will say there's a lot of back and forth.
And if I take one learning from each of your experiences is that a good sustainable legal framework builds that collaboration in the front end. And you, throughout the process, you have everyone on the table and everyone participates, and that just makes it easier and it makes it sustainable. That's what exactly makes it sustainable. So that's a good insight on how that legal framework should work. I want to move to a different topic. And Joe, I'm going to start with you and about disclosure and transparency and the importance of sharing information publicly, and North Dakota is recognized as one of the states that has the best disclosure, policies and practices. So can you share some of that, the importance of being open, of being transparent, and having that level of disclosure, both with the residents of North Dakota and with the capital markets?
Sure. So in terms of sharing information with the public, we have we have certain transparency requirements that the legislature has actually put in law for things that we are required to have available to the public in terms of understanding state spending and where the tax dollars go. All the budget documents that are prepared that reflect the executive budget and those that are prepared after session that reflect the legislative budget are available to the public. One thing that's, I think, really helped public engagement in the whole process has been a significant investment during COVID that an investment in technology and people in the legislative branch, I guess, that allowed kind of a live streaming of all legislative activities and even allowed for remote testimony so that North Dakota is a state with a small population but a fairly large geographic area and climate that sometimes makes it difficult to travel during a legislative session in the winter. And so it allows remote testimony now from folks that can be in remote parts of the state but still offer their input on bills, and they can be engaged in the process. And so I think that level of remote interaction that is now possible has really increased transparency in the entire legislative process, including the budget.
No, thank you. And I do have one recommendation. When weather gets tough during the winter in North Dakota, Puerto Rico has really warm tropical weather. So you're more than welcome to bring your legislature and have a remote meeting here on the island. Alexis, I want to go back to something that you mentioned during your lightning round, and I'm a big fan of of Illinois' book on capital. It's publicly available, and I strongly encourage everyone to take a look at it because it's not only a book on what Illinois does, but it has a really good disclosure on what capital planning and budgeting is. It's almost like a textbook. And especially in light of the challenges and situation in Illinois, how important has it been for you as a budget director and for Illinois as a jurisdiction to have that level of disclosure and have that book out there?
Yes, so I actually brought you a copy of the Capital book, but this is our publication that we put out annually. This is the Capital budget. The operating budget book is another 600 or 700 pages. Overall, Illinois is about a $200 billion appropriation across all of our funds. And so it is really complicated, but we do our best in the Capital budget book to tell the story of capital and not just list projects, but kind of provide updates on what our projects are doing and the impact that they're having, and really go into details on the revenues that are supporting it. And we do multiple levels of documents. So we do the really detailed ones. We have Excel sheets that have all 10,000 lines of our budget. And then we have a shorter PowerPoint that tries to communicate the story of the budget.
And one of the things going through the book and taking a look at it, and one of the things I think is really valuable is for people who work in budget offices and people who do this every day, some of these conversations might be second nature, but it might be difficult to convey that message to the rest of the population. I think you guys do a really good job in explaining the basics and bringing it to a level that people can understand and can relate to how it impacts their daily lives. Ohio, Christina, in your case, and I want to ask specifically about disclosures on reserves. How do you manage reserves, and how do you disclose that process of setting aside money for reserves?
So again, there's a statutory framework. We have a rainy day fund, and the General Assembly sets the maximum limit that can go to the rainy day fund. It is actually in statute that if we have excess budget surplus at the end of the fiscal year. There's a waterfall of some goes to the rainy day fund and what happens to it. So it's very prescriptive in law, but we are very transparent about where our rainy day fund is. We have the Ohio Checkbook, ohiocheckbook.gov, and it has a page that shows every time we make a transfer to the rainy day fund, how much is there. There's a little description with the statutory requirements. So with the rainy day fund, it is very transparent. It is in statute. We have other reserves that we've been very transparent about, particularly during COVID. We set aside a Medicaid reserve fund, HHS reserve fund, because we knew that when the enhanced federal match went away, our enrollment would still be high. So we set aside a special reserve fund using that enhanced match, such that we could manage the rollback of enrollment on Medicaid. And we worked with the General Assembly on that. We were very transparent with all of our testimony on how much is there. The other benefit of the checkbook is that the general public can see every penny that is received to the state and every penny that is spent from the state. Every transaction, revenue and spending, is on a website for the general public. It reminds us it is not our money. It is not our money, it's the general public's money, and they deserve to be able to see where it's going, what's coming in, and where it's going.
Oh, that's great, and that level of transparency, that level of disclosure is what we want to achieve and we want to have, just to make sure that the people's money, that people know where their money is. So that I think that examples like yours are very important for us to have
and I'll make a pitch that it's really easy to put together once you have an ERP, right? Once you have the system and all the information is there, the data is there, it is very easy to create the website.
It's all about the building blocks, get the basics, and then everything flows from that. So and the ERP system, Puerto Rico has been working on an ERP system and trying to address the disconnected accounting systems that we have. But once you have that foundation, it allows you to do something like that. So that's one of the practical benefits and importance of having connected systems that work. We've been talking about building for the future and building a sustainable future for Puerto Rico, but we do have a reality, and we have to comply with PROMESA and comply with the requirements of PROMESA to end the board's mandate. So tying that to reserves and to the rating agencies. One of the requirements under PROMESA is that Puerto Rico regains access to capital markets at reasonable rates. So, Alexis, in your experience, in your case, how does your reserves policy and your reserves disclosure tie to what the expectations and the criteria of the rating agencies are?
We've spent a lot of time with the rating agencies in the last 7 years and have really tried to dig in and understand their methodologies. 2 of the 3 that we work with primarily have pretty transparent rating scorecards that they use, where really you can take your own data that you have for your entity and kind of plug it into their database and predict a rating. The other one's a little more based on the analyst's feelings, but you can really see the impact that reserves have in the rating scorecard, and that was one of the reasons that we have really focused on building reserves in Illinois as part of our strategy to improve our credit rating. Because you can see, for Moody's and S&P, there's 6 or 7 factors, and reserves is really one of the heavily weighted ones, that and debt burden. And so we've kind of tried to focus on those. Building the reserves was a little easier than paying down some of our debts, and so that was one that we did focus on. As Joe mentioned, there were some examples of significant surpluses in the last few years, and really rather than trying to use that for ongoing spending, we use that to pay down our debts and build our reserves as part of that overall strategy with the rating agencies.
And that's one of the many reference points that we're using to design this new system for Puerto Rico, not only because it's related to PROMESA, but because that's what the market expects. That's the criteria that apply to Illinois, to North Dakota, to Ohio. It's the same criteria that they will apply to Puerto Rico. So if we want to design a system that's consistent with the market and it's consistent with expectations, that's a reference point that we certainly need to look at. And Joe, you talked about the volatility and the discipline and resisting the temptation of using funds when you have surpluses. But looking at the flip side, how do you resist the temptation, or how do you put guardrails into your reserve system so that you don't overuse them when you don't necessarily get the revenues that you were expecting?
Yeah, so it's a combination of statutory and constitutional frameworks that govern what goes into the rainy day funds and what the balances are. We have our primary rainy day fund is called the Budget Stabilization Fund. And it sounds like it's similar to Ohio, where if we have an amount of money at the end of a biennium in our general fund that exceeds a certain threshold, that will get transferred in to replenish that fund or bring it up to the right level. It's capped in statute at 15% of our general fund spending. Anything over that will go back to the general fund as earnings. And that's a statutory framework, and so it could be changed, but the legislature has been very supportive of keeping that money there because they've seen, especially the legislators that have some tenure and have been around, they've seen volatility, they've seen ups and downs in the cycle. There's been times when we've needed that money in the rainy day fund, and so they're protective of that. So I guess that legislative buy-in and understanding, kind of that historical perspective is super important. And in terms of dealing with the rating agencies, we always get somewhat low marks for the volatility of our revenue streams and the concentration of risk that we have in energy and agriculture sectors, which is just an unavoidable fact based on how, even though there's diversification, we're still concentrated in those areas, and so it's subject to swings. But we do get high marks from the rating agencies because we have those reserve funds, and they see that as adequate insurance against the volatility that will certainly come.
And again, it goes back to the framework and to the system and having not only the rules, but then the practices and the visibility and information systems to be able to monitor and make sure that you're sticking to that framework that was created. One of the things that I heard about, I heard from other budget directors that budgeting is many times making decisions today while you worry about the future, and that's part of a critical part of being a budget director. In each one of your experiences, how do you reconcile priorities, knowing that you don't have unlimited resources? There are constraints to the resources that you have available, and that you have needs that are there today, but that you also need to be responsible about the future and making future commitments. So, Christina, why don't you take a first stab at that?
Yeah, it's all about prioritization. Once you start with the revenue, what revenue is available, what are the needs, and you work through the priorities, and it's hard, and no one's, everyone is never happy. In the times where there maybe is a surplus, we feel like revenues are doing well. It is really, really important to do those multi-year projections so that is this one-time revenue where we have to prioritize one-time spending, or do we think that this is a new level? Our governor talks about planting trees a lot, planting trees under the shade of which he will never see. And when it comes to spending surpluses, we really look to those one-time things that would benefit for future generations that might not otherwise be incorporated into the budget.
I actually love that analogy because that's exactly what many times budgeting is. You are planting trees and you don't get to see the benefit of a tree growing for maybe 10, 20 years. We got to make sure that you plant it right in the right place and you give it a chance to actually grow and bear fruit and give shade and all that. So that is actually a great analogy for what we do. Joe, how about you guys?
So, I mean, that is the kind of the fun of our jobs, I think, and the challenge of it too is that balancing of priorities and working with starting with the governor and defining what that level of resources are going to be, having a reasonable, trusted forecast that in our case is, because of small staff size, we work in collaboration with an external consultant to bring validity to that number that we start with, but then taking whatever that level of resources is and working with the governor to fit his priorities within that. And then we always start from a place of balance because we have that constitutional requirement for the governor's budget to be balanced. And you know, we collaborate with the legislature, but of course they're going to make their own changes and set their own priorities. But there is that balance of power. The governor in North Dakota does have some, although not as broad as Illinois, but some veto powers, and so that ensures that in the end there is still some alignment with those priorities that he has set, and there is still that constitutional requirement that budget that passes through the legislative process is still balanced and is not resulting in a deficit for North Dakota.
Alexis, Illinois, how do you establish and act on priorities?
So Illinois is a little different than a lot of other governmental units. We have about 700 different accounts in our state treasury, so we have money in a lot of different places. So the revenue forecast then is really important. We do a revenue forecast for each of those separate accounts. And then, you know, we work with our agencies to identify really what do they need to maintain what they've been doing so far, what goals have we accomplished, what are things that need to keep going forward, and then we kind of try to match that back to the revenue forecast. So the revenue forecast is really a key part. And then it's a little bit like a puzzle because of all the different funds that we have to try to make it work. And then we do often get to a point where we then kind of take it to the governor and say, okay, you know, this is the remaining problem that we have. Are you comfortable with proposing these cuts? Obviously, the legislature has to pass it, but are you comfortable with making these cuts? Or are there revenue adjustments that you want to propose in your introduced budget that you feel comfortable with? Are there, you know, new priorities? But it really is kind of a giant puzzle for us. So.
And you bring a very important point, and I just want to highlight is that each one of your states has its own process, and there are differences, but the building blocks are the same, and the principles are the same. And I think that's an important part of the message that we're trying to convey here today, that there are certain things that are standard, and you can adapt them to local situation, the size of your economy, the 700 accounts that you may have. But in the end, it's all about knowing what your revenues are, making informed decisions, and monitoring, and being transparent about that. So I think we can see consistency within the differences that each one of you have presented in your situation. And I know we're running up on time, so I want to do one final question for each of you. We know that things will not always go well, and there were times that you need to be aware of what's happening. So in your experience and your recommendation for us here in Puerto Rico, We can create a new system, you know, all the guardrails and everything, but what are the early warning signs that we should monitor so that we make sure we don't fall back into structural imbalance? And Alexis, why don't you start on that?
Yeah, so my background started in revenue forecasting, and as far as warning signs, we monitor our revenue collection on a daily basis, weekly basis, monthly basis. We publish our monthly expenditures and revenue report to try to show stakeholders how our revenues are coming in. So that's the first early warning sign, is either something's off on the expenditure side or the revenue side. When you're doing a multi-year forecast, what's a big concern is if your expenditure modeling going forward is growing faster than your revenue modeling. And so you then have to have that conversation with the governor and the legislature on that's going to cause problems in the out years. And so really those are the places where we start. And then how we're using one-time revenue. So if we do have one-time revenues, what are we doing with those? That's a big warning sign. Are we using that to pay off debts or to set aside reserves, or are we using it to support ongoing spending?
Christina, what should we be looking out for in the future to make sure that we don't fall back?
Yeah, so Ohio also does monthly financial reports. We monitor the revenue and spending daily, and we publish a monthly financial report to the governor, and it has economic data, so leading economic information. Because we're heavily sales tax state, we watch the consumer sentiment index. We watch, you know, there's a lot of leading economic indicators that we watch to kind of tip us off of how things are going. But we monitor the revenue and expenses on the revenue side. We break it down to a very granular level that we're monitoring so that we know what's happening. If we see higher receipts one month than what we anticipated, do we expect to give refunds in the spring? Is it timing, or is it real? And we have those conversations with our agencies on the spending side. So if something is spending ahead of schedule, is it really ahead of schedule, or is it just timing of they paid something out before they thought they would? So it is that level of granularity that we do on a monthly basis and we make public so that the public can see, do we expect to actually land where we said we would, or are we running ahead of schedule on either revenues or expenses?
No, that's great. And Joe, in your case, any recommendations, any thoughts on what that monitoring system should look like? What should we should be looking for to avoid falling back?
Well, I guess like Illinois and Ohio, we do watch our revenues closely. Our tracking and our is monthly, mostly on the revenue side, not so much on the expenditure side. There's certain statutory checks that make sure that spending is following the right pattern. But we watched our revenues closely. We publish that monthly to the public and the legislature, those tracking reports. And then we do have a mechanism in North Dakota where if it looks like our revenues are missing the forecast on the negative side, in our office we have the ability to do a new forecast. And if we would determine that we would be looking at a shortfall because of a revenue decline, we can, through the executive branch, we can reduce spending and to make sure that we come in line. And we actually have to do some of that reduction before we can even access our budget stabilization fund. So there's kind of a dual process in place where in the executive branch we can reduce spending and access the budget stabilization fund to make sure that we stay in balance.
All right. One final thought, and before I let you go, and again, I want to thank you all three for being here and sharing your time with us, and not only sitting here and being part of the panel, but I know that you've invested time in learning about Puerto Rico and learning about our situation, getting prepared to be here and be able to share your experience. So I want to ask you, final thoughts with one very specific question. In your experiences as budget directors, as people who've devoted a significant part of your professional life to work on budget offices and deal with these issues, can we do it? Can Puerto Rico do this? Can Puerto Rico do this fiscal transformation? Christina.
Oh, sure. Yeah, I mean, it sounds like you already have the will and you have the beginning of the structure. It's hard work. It's a lot of hard work. And it's collaboration and understanding there's competing priorities. There are always competing priorities. And everyone is never going to be happy all the time. But it can absolutely be done.
Can we, Joe?
I think you absolutely can. Puerto Rico is no different than the states represented here or states around the country that each have their own unique challenges. And, our challenges in North Dakota are different than the states on each side. I mean, we each have our own challenges. It takes collaboration, the will to do it, the desire to create guardrails and framework that ensure, fiscal discipline going forward, but it absolutely can be done.
Alexis, you're closer. Can we do it?
Yes. I mean, as they've said, it is a lot of hard work, but when you have a lot of love for the work that you're doing and the people that you represent, the taxpayers, and the people that depend on us, you just throw it all in and you can get it done, because really the budget is one of the foundational pieces to economic stability and economic development. That's the conversation I know we've had with a lot of business owners in Illinois, and really just average taxpayers in Illinois, is stability of the budget gives everybody a lot more pride in their state, and then that pays itself, grows the trees. But I know there's a lot of love here for Puerto Rico, and I think that that's the first key, is that you love your territory, your Commonwealth, and are willing to put in the time to get there, and you can do it.
There is a lot of love for Puerto Rico, and there's a lot of commitment from the board and from the administration to get it done, and we will get it done. So I want to thank you. Thank you so much for your time again. Thank you for being here. Looking forward to continuing this conversation with you, because we will do it with your help, and we want you back here in Puerto Rico. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Juan Carlos, and thanks to the panelists for sharing their insights and experiences. Although this concludes our first panel, the conversation doesn't end here. You can scan the QR code on the big screen to submit questions for the Q&A session that will take place later during this program. If you need assistance, the Oversight Board team is happy to help.
And I just want to take the opportunity. I know we speak a lot regarding the state budget officers, our budget directors. They represent the executive branch. Having worked in the legislature for nearly 20 years before I became budget director, I can tell you the partnership with the legislature is of utmost importance. And I want to recognize that the Speaker of the House, Johnny Mendez, is here, as well as the Chairman of Ways and Means, Eddie Charbonnier. The Minority Whip, Representative Domingo Torres, is here. And the OPAL Executive Director, which is actually one of the early reforms, which is starting to score legislative bills. So the OPAL Executive Director Hecria Martinez is also here. And we're joined by former Speaker of the House, Tatito Hernandez, and a former Ways and Means Chair that we've worked with as well, Jesus Santa. So the Mayor of Camoy, who is also the head of the Federation, is also here. And without the partnership from both the municipal governments, but the legislature in getting a statutory framework, you're going to hear from the budget directors are all working under a statutory framework that exists in their individual states. And that is one of the things that Puerto Rico does not have, and will need the partnership of the legislature in order to make those reforms. So your presence here is important, and thank you.
Thank you, Robert. We are now ready for our second lightning talk about reliable economic and revenue forecasts. Please welcome back Shelby Kearns and welcome Sofia Vicaro, Executive Director of the Utah Governor's Office of Planning and Budget and Senior Advisor to Governor Spencer Cox.
Sophia, Utah's long been regarded as a leader in revenue forecasting, in stress testing, and other models for states. So excited to have this conversation with you about economic and revenue forecasts. I want to follow up on something that Joe mentioned about updating forecasts. Your state updates their forecast multiple times a year. What triggers a revision to your revenue forecast?
Yeah, thank you, Shelby. And first, before I answer that, I just want to acknowledge everyone for being here, and really grateful to be part of what you have going on, and want to compliment all the work that's been done so far. What you're trying to set going forward is going to be really, really important, and love that the legislative branch is here as well, because that will require a collaborative effort with everybody. In terms of how our revenue structure is framed, it might help to just provide a little more detail on what Utah looks like, what we do. We monitor revenue on a quarterly basis, and we have a short legislative cycle, 45-day window. We have a governor's budget that we propose to the legislature. We do that in the fall, and then in the winter time from January to March, the legislature begins their work. And so we do officially meet twice to revise our estimates. We meet to build the governor's budget, and then we do that again during the legislative session cycle and make any updates to whatever revenue we thought we would have when we built the governor's budget. So we do that, heavily monitor that on a very frequent basis to build the governor's budget recommendations, and then again to see how much money we actually have.
And when you're doing that, what assumptions need revisions most frequently, and how did you build some safeguards around those?
So we have a couple of what we call state funds, bigger sources of revenue, our general fund, which is our state sales tax, as well as our income tax. So two major sources of revenue that we call our state funds. That's where we see some volatility, and that requires the most monitoring. So that's where we end up revising and really putting safeguards around that. So we do that a lot on the budgeting side. So we have our revenue, and we do a lot of risk exercises as well. But there's probably three activities I would say that are really important to safeguard that revenue. One is stress testing. We do heavy stress testing on our revenue. We stress test for volatility and try to project into the future to see how volatile a revenue source is going to be. And we have a 3-year cycle. We do that collaboratively with the legislative branch. Really important that we're on the same page on that. And then also we look at our expenditures on the major expense side. So public education, what's going on there. Public education's our biggest, more than half of our state funds go to education. And then we also look at just the various major types of programs like Medicaid, for example, and the state portion that we contribute to Medicaid. And so we do some budgeting practices we call a budget toolkit, where we in the executive branch are on the same page with the legislative branch on determining if we do have less revenue, how will we budget? There was a lot of talk from previous states of using ongoing revenue for ongoing things. We do that, of course, by nature. We work with agencies in the event our revenue has to get projected down. We tell them to scale back expenditures. That frees up some money in the current year that can then be carried over into the future years. We also have some money we set aside, ongoing money we set aside that we only spend on one-time things, that we call that budget buffers. Education is a big portion of that. We have close to $500 million that we set aside in ongoing money that we only spend on one-time things. And that way, if our economy or something bad happens, we can go there first and make sure that we're being measured in that way. So we do have a lot of activity we do on the budget side of things. And stress testing with the legislative branch on the revenue side of things. And then one more example I'd like to share is just on the risk side, COVID. As you all know, all your economic indicators were not as reliable as they were previously. We had a lot of uncertainty on what we were monitoring on the revenue side and not sure what data we could rely on. And so when our revenue projections came in, we had a high, medium, low estimate, and we set aside what we called high-risk revenue. We deemed a certain portion of that to be high risk, and we set that aside and made sure that was spent on one-time things so that if that revenue didn't come to fruition, we would be able to move forward and still continue with our critical services.
Those are great tips to build into any budget. Speaking about being on the same page, can you quickly kind of give us an idea about how your consensus revenue forecasting works?
Yeah, so we, of course, again, a lot of what is key is having an ongoing framework that lives on beyond who's governor, beyond who's in the legislature, having a permanent framework that you can operate by. And what we do in Utah is we have what we call a consensus process that involves the legislative economists, it involves the executive branch economists, and we also bring in the tax commission, the revenue folks that are independent. We remove all the politics by making sure we all come to the table and we're operating on the same budget. So when we have a revenue consensus, that means when we're building the governor's budget, we're building a budget on the same number that the legislature is going to be using when they build their budget. That's very critical. Some states don't have that, and you might have a governor's budget that will operate off of a different number than the legislature. So one way to remove the politics and ensure that you stay true to the process is by having that consensus process and having a third party also participate in that can remove a lot of the politics from it and just get true numbers. And again, we do high, medium, low, and average that out. And we all agree to run with the average, and then all the politics come on the budget side of things, on how we decide to build the budget recommendations and so on and so forth. But the revenue, we consider that to be our sacred cow, and we stay true to what we all agree that number will be.
Love it. I love all the discussion about partnerships and being on the same page. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Shelby and Sophia. And before we continue, if you've lost your cell phone in the ladies' restroom, please go by reception. It is there waiting for you. We now move to our second panel on budget transformation and best practices. Please welcome back on stage Cristina Fras. And also joining us is Sofia Di Caro and Andrew Miner, Director of the State Budget Division in New Mexico. This panel is moderated by John Nixon, board member of the Financial Oversight and Management Board for Puerto Rico. Please welcome everyone to the stage.
Well, this is great. Thank you so much for being here today. Again, I just can't thank you enough. We have Sophia DeCarl from Utah. We have Christina Frost from Ohio, as you know, and Dr. Andrew Miner. So we're really excited to have you on stage with us today. First of all, I'd just like to start with kind of your impressions on why is this important?
Thank you, John. And I, again, have to emphasize the great work that's been done. There's so much. When I read about where you have all been, it's a pretty big deal, and one that I think, is probably uncomfortable to talk about what's been done and to pat yourselves on the back, but you've really been on a journey. And it's critical to keep that good momentum going forward. I think, what you're doing is investing in yourselves and investing in the place that you love. And that's why what we're doing today is so critical, and honestly, just grateful to be part of it.
Thank you, Sylvia. Christina?
I think it's wonderful to see put it closer. I think it's wonderful to see some members of the business community here. I think it's really important, for economic growth, to have a sound, stable budget. It's the revenue projections and the budget produce stability when there's consensus, and that's really what business thrives on, is stability. So the economic momentum of Puerto Rico is really important to get the budget right. And as I said before, it's not our money, right? It's the public's money. So the citizens of Puerto Rico deserve a sound and stable budget.
Dr. Miner?
Good morning. Is this on? Oh, yeah, it is. Okay. Good morning, and thank you. I just want to echo my fellow budget director's thoughts on just thank you for having us down here, and it's just a real honor to be down here, and hopefully I can provide some sort of insights that help you all. I just think getting the budget is so important, right? It's kind of like we always view it as kind of the one thing that the government has to do, and everything kind of flows from that, right? Like the budget is a foundational policy and moral document. I always go back to a quote from former President Biden, or he was vice president at the time, who said, don't tell me what you value, show me your budget, and I will tell you what you value, right? And so that just speaks to how important getting the budget right is, and so just the more we can do to help establish those policies and procedures and everything, I think we'll get everybody off on the right foot. So thanks.
Thank you. Puerto Rico has defined many of the right reforms. This panel is about the execution, right? I mean, obviously we're at a critical point. There's been a lot of work done. I believe, as I've said for years in being affiliated with the board, that the bankruptcies are important, but this is the most important because it really is going to help determine the future of the island and the people of Puerto Rico. What separates successful information from reform efforts that stall? Christina, let's start with you on this one.
Ooh, that's a good question. I think when reform efforts stall, it's not a willingness. I think communication breaks down. I think it's so important to continue communications because there will always be competing priorities and different thoughts about how to proceed. But if you can agree to a foundation, if you can agree to the structure and really get that structure right, then the nuances of the how don't tank it. It won't fail because of the how to get there. So I think the foundation of what you're trying to do, there seems to be such a willingness, and if you can iron out some of the details and get that firm structure, then it will succeed.
Excellent. Thank you. Dr. Miner?
Thanks. I think reform can sometimes be a little bit impeded or break down when all of the relevant actors aren't involved in possibly the way they should be. So it's just really important, if you're passing trying to pass some sort of legislation or anything that's going to reform the budget process or do anything else, you need to make sure you've got kind of everybody on board and everybody has buy-in to the process and everybody sees what sort of the causes and effects and costs and benefits are going to be. That includes legislators, it includes executive agencies, external stakeholders, interest groups, all that stuff. Just making sure that everybody is very, the process is very open and transparent, and everybody has a chance to, provide input and see where they're going to be in the process, where should this reform go through. I think it's just really important in actually implementing it and carrying it through.
Excellent, thank you. Sophia?
So government by nature is short term. If you think about the terms that lawmakers run, it's a 2-year cycle. If you think about senators, you think about gubernatorial seats, it's kind of short term. And to make lasting change, you've got to change culture. So it's very difficult, and they contradict in a lot of cases, because how do you, create that cultural lasting change to go beyond? It really comes down to process. I think making sure that you have strong processes in place, and a lot of that, if you can codify and put them into law, everyone's going to be operating off of the same rules of the game, regardless of who's in power at the time. I think that's really important, and that's one of the bigger reasons why short-term efforts fail, because when everyone's gone, who's left to carry that work forward? It's really digging into what are your core values as a society, and coming to the same page on your core values, and putting that on paper so that everyone's operating off the same rules.
Excellent. I'm going to pull on that thread a little bit, because a little known secret about Sofia De Caro is she's actually the Honorable Sofia De Caro. She was actually a member of the Utah House of Representatives. She actually served in the legislative side. She's been a cabinet member of an agency, the Governor's Office of Economic Development, and now she's the state budget director. So let's pull on that a little bit, Sophia. We have the legislature here, we have members of the legislature. Let's talk a little bit more, and to all three of you, but let's talk about the collaboration, because we want to make sure that this isn't just a flash in the pan, right? I mean, these are reforms. I mean, I don't want Puerto Rico to dive back into financial distress. Nobody wants it to return. We want people to be able to live here, thrive here, have economic opportunity. Talk a little bit about that collaboration. Why is it important specifically to have these processes formalized in statute, and to have, budget procedures? I know Director Rivera has been working on those, but how do you go about that, and why is that important? I'll just leave it at that.
Yeah, I would say not only is it important, it's critical. It is critical if you're going to make lasting change. Every one of our states has a partisan makeup where you have Democrats and Republicans, Utah as well. But, John and I were having an earlier conversation, and we all agreed that even if Utah's a supermajority Republican state, but even the Democrats can all agree that there's sacred cows that you just don't violate, and that's making sure our financial status stays strong. That's just a line in the sand that you don't, if you're doing some piece of legislation that's going to cross that line, even the Democrats can agree that, no, we won't go there if it's going to damage our AAA bond rating status, or, eat away our future seed corn, because that's, in fact, what it will do. So I would say, again, it's going to take changing culture. To change that culture, put it on paper. How do you put it on paper? Codify it where you can all, I'm sure, agree on the great work that's been done so far, and to make sure that good work continues, and you're building a strong foundation on that, to put that on paper, put it in code, and then also put some policies and procedures around it that will have lasting effect. No matter who's in the offices, no matter who's in these budget offices doing the work, they will be able to pick up the work, pick up the paper, and see what's been done, see what the process is, and continue that work.
I'll just say I'm projecting that Sophia is going to be governor of Utah one day, and hopefully she'll hire me as her budget director. Christina.
So to piggyback on what Andrew said, I think it's really important to include all of the stakeholder voices as you're setting up your parameters, because if it's just the government, you have external voices talking to their representatives, their senators, you have lobbyists, so I as much as there's rhetoric around blue ribbon panels or task forces or the like, I think getting the voices in the room so that they have a stake in what's happening going forward is so important. Inviting K-12 education, inviting health and human service nonprofit agencies, the business community, the lobbyists, so that the framework, they understand the framework that's being created, because that's the framework that they're going to operate under too. When they're pitching their agencies, for more money, for new programs, for pilots, for different things, economic development incentives, it is so important that it's not just the executive branch and the legislative branch that comes up with the rules, but it's really informed by the business that's actually happening in Puerto Rico. When I say business, both business and the nonprofit side, education, higher education, so that everyone knows when it's budget time, everyone's on the same page.
Excellent, thank you.
Yeah, so I think it starts with, like we've talked about, the statutory framework. For example, in New Mexico, we have both the State Budget Act that outlines all the procedures for, adopting and implementing the state budget, as well as the Accountability in Government Act, which I believe we were one of the first states to statutorily entrench performance measures into the budget process about a quarter century ago. So, it kind of starts from there, and then from there out, I think you use that as a foundation to just build this strong culture of fiscal discipline and good fiscal practices and budget practices, and that extends to both the executive and the legislative branches. New Mexico was only one of a few states where both the governor and the legislature release their own budget recommendations, and then they kind of fight it out during session. So that gives the legislature a lot of budgetary power, I think more than in a lot of states. And I have to give them a lot of credit for their very strong culture of fiscal discipline, that they have carried through. That is, extends across party lines and just really kind of goes forward and drives everything that they do today to be pretty responsible in how things move forward with the budget, to the extent where it's talking about changes and party switches and stuff like that. I've been through only one gubernatorial transition back in 2019 when we went when we went from a Republican governor to a Democratic governor, and the whole budget process, it did not change as much as I think I thought it might, just because the framework and the discipline were just so built in and entrenched at that point.
Thank you. Let's talk a little bit about internal controls. I mean, obviously, the important thing here is, when we talk about all this stuff that needs to happen in Puerto Rico, obviously there's the provisions, 10, the PROMESA, and 10, the board. But these are best practices that need to happen so we can do that, and then obviously make sure that they're embedded. But what internal controls are essential to making sure that the budgets are executed as executed as enacted? And then how do you enforce accountability? Dr. Miner, I think we're... Sure,
I can start with that. So we have, this has been touched on before, but we have a strong ERP that, we establish the budget. Basically, the legislature passes the budget, the governor signs the budget, agencies kind of submit their operating budgets in accordance with the budget that was passed. We, the State Budget Division, review them, make sure they are technically sound and in line with what was adopted, and then we load all those budgets into the ERP, and those become the controlling budgets for the following fiscal year. So if an agency has, for example, a $10 million general fund budget in a fiscal year, they cannot, if they hit that $10 million in April, they're out of luck. They can't spend anymore. So that really is a pretty strong control. There are certain allowances for them to adjust their budgets during the fiscal year, but that is a whole process that involves both us our review, and the legislative finance staff review as well. So, there's multiple layers of review and control and inclusion in those sorts of processes.
Thank you. And if people don't follow the process, what happens?
there is the statutory possibility of legal penalties if someone, my boss or the state controller were enabled an agency to overspend its general fund budget, there is the possibility of criminal proceedings.
Wow, that's pretty tough. Christina?
Yeah, so within our ERP, we have each agency break down their budgets to a lower level, so payroll, contracts, maintenance, subsidies, and we load the budgets on that more granular level, such that an agency really can't overspend their plan. Now, agencies have some ability to move between the categories. Again, they cannot exceed their appropriation, but we load we call them allotments, quarterly. So agencies have to break it down and say, this is how much payroll we expect to spend on a quarterly basis, contracts, subsidies, and then they are held to that within the system. If an agency needs to move in between, it's a request. It's a request that's considered. We evaluate where we think they are. Are they really overspending in one area versus another? Or is it, again, a timing issue? Do payments for subsidies need to go out on different time frames? And we evaluate it, and it really helps agencies stay on track because, particularly with payroll, there is always a certainty that we will make payroll by the end of the fiscal year. There is always enough there because we make sure there is enough there. And if agencies are overspending on their contracts, they have to take it from somewhere. It has to come from somewhere, and it forces that stability throughout the fiscal year.
Excellent, thank you. Honorable DeCarlo?
So I would say this really comes down to two things. One is transparency, and the other is reporting requirements, right? So, and that goes to some of what you've said already on your ERP system. That's the transparency side. You've got to have transparency where what you're putting in the system is actually what's going on, and that's exposed publicly so that everyone has visibility on what activity is taking place. On the accountability side, as it relates to reporting, it's helpful in the Utah State Code, for example, all throughout our laws, legislatures requiring state agencies to do something. It's followed up by a public reporting of some kind. That public reporting provides that kind of pressure to then have that accountability and talk about what you've done with that. We have that report back system in all the things we do, even internally in the executive branch, as well as publicly on the legislative side, where you have to report back. Every appropriation, you have to report back how that dollar was spent, and for the agencies out there, because I know that can be intimidating and can also create somewhat of a disincentive of some kind, but it actually is an opportunity for you to showcase the great work you're doing and to use that as an opportunity to show the public what you've been able to do with the resources given, and even to highlight maybe where additional resources may be needed to be able to do even better. So I would just say that having that automatic kind of reporting structure, report back structure, is really critical in keeping that control, both internal, external, and that accountability balance.
Excellent, thank you. So what changes have had the biggest impact on budget preparation? Have there been any recent changes that you've done or things that you just say, wow, this is the ticket to budget preparation and executing and managing the budget?
Well, what I can say is we've spent a lot of time being on the same page with our legislative partners so that when the legislature is asking for data or when we're asking for data, we're asking for the same data. That helps us streamline our resources better too, so that agencies are more effectively using their time. And what we've been able to do is come together on our budget prep system, our preparation system, where we collect the data from the agencies, we're using that, and then the legislature is using that same data from the same system, which helps everybody when we're all on the same page and we've streamlined the information and streamlined our efforts to make sure we're running more efficiently and effectively as we can.
Excellent. Do either of you two want to add to that? Christina, go ahead.
Yeah, so for decades, when the Office of Budget Management in Ohio would put out guidance to the agencies about what they could request in their budget, it had some percentage attached to it. So you can request a maximum of 105% of what you had the previous year and then justify it. In the last 3 budgets, we actually turned that and we said we're not doing targets and caps anymore. You can't request any more than what you had in the previous year unless you show us what your anticipated results are going to be. So if there is a program where you're requesting an increase in funds or a new program, new money, we required a very simple logic model. So, this is what we intend to do. Here are our inputs, here are our outputs, our outcomes, and also how we will measure it so that the agency could justify, here is what we expect the results we expect to get for the additional dollars being put in. And there is a commitment when they make the request that they are actually going to collect the data and demonstrate on a quarterly basis if they get funding. So, kind of switching from that kind of incremental budgeting to really a results focus helps, the prioritization process. It helps everybody stay on the same page with what are we funding and what do we expect to get out of it.
Excellent. Thank you. Dr. Minor, before you go, let me just ask you, and you can respond to that question as well as part of your response. But within PROMESA, there's this little provision that says, it's actually not too little, but it talks about modified accrual. Okay, so the requirement is for structurally balanced budget under modified accrual accounting. Now, some states do that, some states don't. Typically when you have financial distress as part of legislation or the oversight, modified accrual is a requirement that's entered in. I know that New Mexico has done that. Can you talk about the impact of that and why it's beneficial to the budgeting process?
Sure. If I can just respond real quickly to the last question.
Absolutely.
So, yeah, no problem.
Tie it all together.
I just wanted to add that, add kind of a lot on what Christine said. In New Mexico, it's kind of a work in progress. We had, we replaced our budget system, our budget preparation system about 4 or 5 years ago. That streamlined a lot of kind of like the rote processes in terms of like getting numbers in and requesting budgets and all that. And so now we're really in the middle of working on like expanding good information that agencies are provided in justification of their budget requests, both for like recurring budget requests, expansions, or non-recurring amounts, because we've been lucky to have a fair amount of non-recurring money available in New Mexico one-time money available in New Mexico the past few years. So just really working on getting agencies to justify those needs and those expenses. And we've also passed legislation that implements a lot of what Christina was talking about in terms of like having agencies show logic models and stuff like that. Okay, so modified accrual. So, this is an interesting question for me because I'm not an accountant by trade. So I haven't spent a lot of time examining the different ways that you can account for things or budget things, but I've worked with budgets in New Mexico for 13 years, and so it's just what I know, and it just makes sense, and it's kind of like you could do it differently, like I don't know. But anyway, I think it's very beneficial from my perspective as budget director that a modified accrual is very closely tied to the budget, and it helps everyone involved in the process kind of understand, are my anticipated revenues going to be sufficient to cover the expenses that I am expected to incur during this period, right? Because modified accrual recognizes revenues when they are available, and it recognizes expenses when they are incurred not necessarily when the cash payment is made, right? So, and that gets really important when something might cross a fiscal year. So, like, for example, you incur the expense in June, but maybe you don't have to actually pay it till July. That's a different fiscal year. Well, under modified accrual, you're going to recognize that expense in June, right? And probably the same fiscal year in which you collected the revenue. So that just really helps people understand, like, okay, here are my expected revenues for the year. Here are all my expected expenses for the year. I need to make sure that I have enough revenues to cover these expenses during this fiscal year, because I'm not going to be allowed to do any sort of like shifty maneuvering with the cash to like move some revenues off the books or move it or delay some liabilities into the next fiscal year, and then then the next fiscal year maybe I don't have the revenues for it, right? And then now I'm in trouble because I've got liabilities that I don't have the revenues to cover, right? So I think that it helps avoid those tricky situations. And on the revenue side, I think it helps agencies plan for their expected revenues, not kind of like base their budgets off of, kind of like sometimes a little bit of wishful thinking of like hypothetical, like long-term revenues that maybe we'll get. Although I will say that this is also something that we're still working on in New Mexico to make sure agencies are, with general fund, it's not such a big deal because their general fund is their general fund, and that's what they're going to get for the year. But it's a lot for a lot of these agencies that have other revenues, other state funds, like they raise fees or whatever, just getting them to really focus on like, okay, well, the legislature gave me, a $5 million budget for my fees this year, but that's based on our best estimate of how much revenue you're going to collect in your fees based on, the past few years and trends and all that. Well, you need to plan for what happens if something tanks and you only get $4 million of revenue, right? And if that's the case, they need to come to us and we need to work with them to reduce their budget accordingly to account for that. So I think those are some of the advantages.
Excellent, thank you. Key process obviously helps with the transparency as well. I appreciate those comments. Real quick, and we're coming up on time, but I do have a couple of more questions. Quickly talk, debt policy and reserve strategies. How do you incorporate those into your budgeting?
Yeah, so I mentioned we had a toolkit that we kind of operate by when we look at our revenue. We use that as one of our toolkits in the tool basket. We keep our debt capacity as our last case scenario backup plan in the event something happens, our revenue goes south, then we know, again, we've set aside ongoing money that we can spend one time on capital. If that goes away and we no longer have that as a tool, we now can then use debt capacity and borrow to pay for the buildings we need. And so we look at it as a tool. And so, we have a constitutional debt limit. We are well below that. I think we have under $1 billion left of debt to pay, and all that money is set aside. Our debt service is set aside already to make those payments. So that's already off the table. We know our debt's good, but we do see that as another sacred cow, as another tool that we want to preserve in the event times go bad, which is why it's so important to have a good borrowing rate so that when the economy's bad, maybe rates get more expensive, you can afford to do that. Yeah.
Sounds good. Sorry about the party next door. I'm not sure what's going on.
It's our background music. It adds to the effect.
Do either of you two, I know we're about on time. There's a couple more questions I have. Do you want to quickly respond to this one?
Well, I'll just say that, we also have a legal framework for our debt capacity, but one of the most helpful tools to keeping our debt low is being very transparent about what the debt service is going to cost in our operating budget. So, there are a lot of competing priorities in the operating budget, and being very transparent, okay, legislature or governor, you want to do this, $600 million thing in the capital budget that we will bond for, that's taking $40 million of debt service out of the next operating budget. So knowing that cost and being very transparent up front helps prioritize, I think.
Excellent.
Real quick, the one thing I would add is something that is very important for both the governor and the legislature when they're putting forward their budget recommendations is the reserve level. Reserves usually expressed as a percentage of recurring appropriations. Both the governor and the legislature always have a target in mind when they craft their budget recommendations, and we want to try to maintain that as high as possible. In recent years, it's been between 25–30%, which is really good for us, but that is a very, that is kind of like a baseline, and the budget kind of flows from there.
Excellent. Performance metrics. How do you use them? How do you use them in influencing funding decisions?
How many hours do we have? No, it's real quick. I think I mentioned that New Mexico is, we were an early adopter of performance measures into the budget process back around the turn of the century. The kind of grand compromise was that the budget used to be much more specific. There used to be 12 or 13 expenditure categories identified in the budget bill. That went down to 4 in exchange for agencies having at least a few performance measures in the budget. They have a few in the budget bill. They have more that are not in the budget bill, and they are reported on, some quarterly, the rest annually. But how do they actually influence the budget is the unanswerable question, I would say, because they're very important, right? And the legislature definitely looks at them a lot, but at some point there becomes a big question of well, this program's performance measures are lacking. Does that mean A, we should shut it down, or B, we should give it more money, right? And that's the big question that always kind of legislators and the executive agencies and all them grapple with. So I think they are certainly useful, a really good tool in the toolbox that we should have, because we want to make sure that, we want to know what we're spending taxpayer money on and what sort of return are we getting for these investments, absolutely. But the actual effect on the budget, I think, can go in a lot of different directions.
Excellent. Christina?
I think it's really important to make decisions based on data and not based on how people feel. And when you collect the information and you can say this program was funded with this much and this is the return, it bolsters the buy-in for that program. And I also think as a government, we have a responsibility to our citizens that if we're pumping money into something that is not effective, we stop doing it. So I think performance metrics are really important. Getting the right performance metrics is tricky and it's a challenge. We work very closely with Pew Charitable Research, which I know has close ties with NASBO, and they're very helpful in both educating and helping set performance metrics so that we are basing our decisions on evidence and not who's the loudest in the room.
So we do a ton of work on performance measures in Utah. From the executive branch, we require a lot of strategic planning. Every state agency has to have a strategic plan because we budget in a 2-year window. We want to see 5-year picture of what the strategy is for that respective agency, and we require a lot of performance measures around that also translate into our budget request forms. So when an agency is asking for more money, they have to also include how they're going to measure the performance of whatever it is they're asking for. The legislative branch also asks for a lot of those performance measures, and as we all know, it's very hard to cut a program once you give it life. It's almost impossible to take it back or to get rid of it. Not impossible, but very, very, very difficult. And so the secret is to make sure you're making it hard to make it hard up front to give out resources. And one of the ways to do that is to put really robust performance measures on the front end when the legislative branch, when they're asking for funds, to make sure you're tracking how you're going to measure those outcomes before those funds are even deployed, and making sure that that's part of the decision-making process.
Excellent. So last question, and to me, probably the most important question. These proceedings are being broadcast. We have our wonderful Puerto Rican media here. We have 3 million residents here, Puerto Ricans, who live here on the island. We have multiple businesses, a large business community. Why is this important to them? How will getting this right impact them and their lives going forward? Why should they care? As they're watching the evening news about this budget transformation symposium we had, why would they care, and how will it help them, and how will it benefit their future?
Well, this is your home. You know, I mentioned we, even in Utah, have bipartisan issues that we work through, but the unifier is the love of Utah, the love of our home. I think that would be the message to get involved, that you can actually control your future. It is your future. It's very easy to get involved, and I know that sometimes government sounds boring or it's hard to understand. If you make it transparent, you'll get more involvement. But this is an opportunity for Puerto Rico, a very key opportunity that will live on for generations. So you're not making decisions for today, you're making decisions for future generations down the road, which is in the home that you love. So I would just encourage everyone to listen and to support the work that's going on here, and to engage the business community, engage the citizens here, and to try to get around what unifies you, which is your love for your home.
Christina?
Yeah, I agree. And I think, you know, I said before, stable budgets give predictability. And the business community likes predictability. It allows them to plan ahead. Do I invest here? Where do I put my money? Do I grow? Do I shrink? It allows individuals to make plans for their lives. Where do I want my kids to go to school? Is this the right time to buy a house? And you know, should I go on that vacation, or do I need to save my money because we don't know what's going to happen? So I think it really does impact the individual basis. It's important to give citizens predictability, and you do that through stable budgeting.
Thank you.
Yeah, just real quick. I mean, I agree with everything Sophia and Christina said, and it just kind of goes back to how I opened with. You know, Puerto Ricans, they deserve to have a budget and a government that reflects their values and that addresses them and serves them in a fiscally responsible way. So I think, you know, now and of course many years into the future. So I think that's why it's so important.
Excellent. So it's so important to get involved. Again, this is an effort that's going to take everybody in this room and everybody on the island. Puerto Rico is a beautiful place. I mean, you have wonderful opportunities here on the island, and it's important that we build this stabilization going forward in these reforms. And I so appreciate your willingness to come down, spend your time on the island. I hope you can disfrutar mucho cuando está aquí. That's enjoy it very much while you're here. But again, thank you for your time.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Remember, the conversation doesn't end now. You can scan the QR code on the screen to submit questions for the Q&A session later today. If you need assistance, the Oversight Board team is happy to help. Also, we have a quick announcement. We have a second phone that was left at the coffee station. If it is yours, please stop by the sign-in table. We will now take a 5-minute break before we continue with our talks and panels at the Financial Oversight and Management Board for Puerto Rico Symposium, A Better Plan, Symposium on Puerto Rico's Fiscal Future, Budget Tools, Principles, and State Practices. Please return to your seats. Our program will continue now. We are ready for our lightning talk on strengthening the budget office and building institutional capacity. Please welcome back on stage Shelby Kearns and Andrew Miner.
Andrew, I'm so happy to be able to have this conversation with you since you are instrumental in strengthening budget offices nationwide as our instructor at the NASBO Introduction to State Budgeting Seminar. You train analysts from around the nation, so perfect person to ask about skills and how to strengthen the budget office and make it a good place for folks that does the important work. So what core skill sets do you feel like are non-negotiable for a high-functioning budget office?
Thank you, Shelby. So I want to focus on something that's maybe a little different than what some people might expect. So, you know, you think of like the technical skills of like how to do budget analysis and all that stuff, and the stuff that I kind of like train about, right? And that's very important, right? But people from a lot of different backgrounds are capable of learning that stuff, right? Like that's what I've found in you know, working with new analysts for over a decade. They don't have to be necessarily from finance or economics or whatever. Lots of different people have the capacity for those skill sets. And I think you can tell if you're like, you know, hiring somebody, you can tell just by like reviewing their resume and their transcripts and maybe one or two questions on the interview. You're like, okay, this person will be fine, right? This person can learn how to do budgets. What I'm really looking for in a new analyst are a couple things. One, communication, right? So because so much of being a budget analyst, being a budget officer is communication with your agencies and with the legislature, and just being able to get that message across, be able to connect with people, you know, and that could be there's lots of different communication styles, and they each have their different purposes. So you can recruit different communication styles, but just having that ability to communicate effectively with people. And another one is a customer service mindset. So, you know, we're an oversight agency, like all state budget offices, you're an oversight agency, and that's a very important job. But I think sometimes if you put too much emphasis on oversight first, it can build a bit of a, you know, almost adversarial relationship, and that's no good for anybody, right? So just kind of like if you focus on building that customer service mindset and orientation first, then agencies kind of like, I can work with them, right? And then the oversight and the necessary, you know, rules and regulations and all that stuff follows from that naturally. You know, just last week, somebody from an agency told one of our staff, oh, well, you know, state budget division is a lot different than it was like 5 years ago because, you know, 5 years ago, I would ask them a question and the answer I'd get would be like, figure it out yourself. And I was like, really? Because I was here 5 years ago and I wouldn't have ever said that. But, you know, at some point, the truth matters less. Excuse me, the truth matters less than the perception, right? What was important was that guy's perception 5 years ago. And we worked really, really hard to change that and just put out this image of us as like, how can we serve you better? And in the process, you know, do the oversight that's necessary. And sorry, the last thing I would say is when you're kind of thinking about your team as a whole, just building a cohesive team that you think is going to just really work well and accomplish the mission together.
It is. When you have a good team, it's easier to do hard work together. One of the things that we talk about a lot at NASBO is how to institutionalize processes, knowledge, all of these things as states go through leadership transitions, particularly gubernatorial transitions, budget director transitions. How do you do that in New Mexico?
Sure. So, you know, budgets operate in cycles, right? And so at every point in the year, we're kind of doing something that's new, but we've done it a year before, right? So, okay, now we're doing budget requests, and now we're doing operating budgets, now we're preparing for the session, all that stuff. So at each step of the process, we train, right? We make sure that both our old analysts know and they remember everything, and also our new analysts have clear expectations of what to do. We also have a mentorship system. So, everybody who comes in, no matter their experience level, is going to be working with a mentor within the office that's going to, pass those things down on to the new people and help them just feel comfortable with everything, because, it takes at least a year before you're even exposed to everything that our office does, right? So just getting across the message that, you're going to be okay. There's a lot to learn. It's going to take a while, but that's fine. Here are the expectations we're going to hold you to, but we're all here to succeed together. And so I think it's just entrenching those sort of things while also still always seeking input and feedback from both your staff and also from state agencies or other stakeholders of how can we improve things, or how can we change things and move forward with the process.
And last question, what are areas of capacity that you feel like governments risk sort of underinvesting in, particularly when you're trying to balance that with recruitment and retention in competition with the private sector?
Yeah, sure. So I think it goes back a little bit to the first question where I say, when I mentioned kind of soft skills, right? Like, it's very easy to recruit based on hard skills that you can look at a resume or a transcript and be like, okay, this person checks these boxes, right? They've got the 4 years of statistics classes, or whatever. But just like making sure that you invest both in recruitment, in training, in career development, and those soft skills that are going to increase communication, customer service, and just getting along with people, and because it's a very people-oriented job, right? Working with other agencies and trying to get along with them and the legislature, and just enhancing those skills as much as possible to promote sort of well-rounded people, because our goal is always, although we hate to lose people, our goal is to train up these folks and send them out into the world as, agency budget directors or CFOs or whatever, and then we can feel, a little bit of pride in our accomplishment that we help prepare the next generation of state leaders.
Fantastic. It's always important to remember that. Appreciate your insights so much. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Shelby and Andrew. It is now time for our final panel. Andrew is already on stage, so please welcome back Christina Frass and Joe Morissette. Financial Oversight and Management Board for Puerto Rico board member Andrew Biggs will moderate this panel. Please welcome everyone to the stage.
Well, thank you very much. I think we've saved the best panel for last. When I joined the Oversight Board close on 10 years ago, my background was in the federal government working in the Social Security program. And something like fixing Social Security is extremely difficult politically to do. But once you do it, once you raise the payroll tax rate or increase the retirement age, it tends to stay fixed. And I discovered eventually that's precisely the wrong way for thinking about what is going on for budgeting for the Commonwealth of Puerto Rico or for states around the country. The better analogy, I think, is a household or a family planning its own finances. They have short-term priorities like paying the rent or buying food. They have long-term priorities like saving for retirement. But amidst all of that, they have a great deal of uncertainty. They have a lot of change that happens that they have to accommodate, that they have to adjust for. They might have a child who enters the family. That introduces new costs. They might get a better job. They might lose their job. So they're constantly adjusting. And I think that's really a better analogy for what happens at the Commonwealth level and what happens in states. So with that context, what I'd like to ask you to start with is to think about, and what has interested me in listening to you all is you come from different states, different parts of the country, different economic backgrounds, and I think you probably face different risks. I wonder if each of you could just talk about the risks that you face, the things that you monitor, and what you watch for in thinking that you may have to adjust budget plans going forward. Would you like to start, Andrew?
Thanks. So like North Dakota, New Mexico is an energy state. We're the #2 producer of oil thanks to the Permian Basin boom of the past few years. So our economy is pretty tied to the price of oil and the severance taxes that we collect from that fund about, I think it's between 35 and 40% of our general fund. So, you know, a price or a significant change in the price of oil can be either a big, you know, upside or downside risk for us. So that's something that both the executive and the legislature monitor very closely. Like, we have a consensus revenue estimating group, much like Sophia described in Utah. I think it basically works about the same way. So that's something that's very important that we need to monitor very closely. And other things, you know, what's going on with the federal budget, and New Mexico is pretty dependent on federal money, both because of, you know, a high percentage of Medicaid population, but also because of big federal facilities that we have in New Mexico, such as a couple national laboratories. So you know, big changes in the federal budget can also have, you know, pretty big downslope effects to New Mexico's budget. So those are some of the things we look at.
Thank you. Christina?
So as I mentioned before, the Ohio legislature has been, for a few decades, decreasing the personal income tax. And for anyone who has tried to estimate revenue, it is challenging when things are consistent. When you're changing the baseline every single year, it becomes even more challenging. How do we know that our assumptions are correct when, you know, if they reduce a bracket or completely cut a bracket, will, you know, the corresponding personal reaction be the same? So managing the revenue estimates in a constantly changing environment is very challenging. And the way that we mitigate risk is to make sure our assumptions put risk on the upside. So super, super conservative. We don't assume that there's going to be a recession every year, right? It's not catastrophic, but we make sure that our estimates are as conservative as is practical to be, such that all of the risk or most of the risk would be in coming over estimates.
Thank you. Joe?
Well, I think that was very well said. You know, we have a volatile revenue stream. Like I've said before, we try to have a very reasonable but conservative forecast that you know, doesn't assume the worst, but definitely errs on the conservative side, and we start with that. And I think that's important. And you know, we've also gone through 15 years of ongoing reductions in our income tax structure, so it's made what was kind of a balanced stool a little bit less balanced in our revenue structure. We're more reliant on sales tax, and we have found that our sales tax is more correlated to oil activity than it ever has been before. We were the #2 oil producing state before New Mexico bumped us into our #3 role, but we are still heavily reliant on oil taxes, and not just the taxes from oil, but the oil activity, because it generates sales tax from the taxable inputs that go into the wells. It has a correlation to our income tax, because there's a lot of mineral wealth that's individually held, and those folks benefit from that mineral activity. So we find that to kind of manage that risk and look forward, we really have an eye on what's happening in the oil industry. We are very connected to our industry partners, like the association that is involved in the industry, our state regulators, and they have an eye on the number of permits that they're issuing, the number of employees in that sector, the number of active drilling rigs, the number of hydraulic fracturing crews. All those things give us kind of a forward look at what's coming for activity. And then, of course, we still have to deal with the volatility on the price side, but it helps us at least understand the production that we can likely expect in the future. And so that's one way where we try to keep our eye on kind of those forward-looking indicators. It's really, to a large extent, focused on that industry.
I think you made, in the context of Puerto Rico and what we go through at the Oversight Board, I think you've made two very important points. One is that the sort of risks and uncertainties you'll face will be unique to the location that you're in, to the jurisdiction that you're in. On the board, we are often monitoring uncertainty in federal funding, whether it's from Medicaid or from FEMA, or thinking about the impacts of adding or losing a large employer in terms of tax revenues. So the uncertainty is unique to the jurisdiction, but it is always present. Everybody faces it, and so a good budgeting process is always going to take that into account. To stretch my sort of household financial planning analogy a little bit further, is thinking about sort of continuity over time. I mean, in my own household, I do most of the financial planning, the investing, and all that. But if something were to happen to me, which we hope it won't, but if something were to happen to me, my wife would have to pick that up and keep going and not start from scratch. And that's been a challenge here in Puerto Rico. When you change administrations, you lose a lot of the staff, you lose the institutional knowledge. And so then people are again starting from scratch. And that holds back the budgeting process sometimes. Can you talk about how you ensure continuity across time, across administrations? If you get a new governor coming in or a new party controlling the legislature, how does the role that you play help them keep the process going smoothly, even though you may have different leadership at the top? Andrew?
Sure. I think it goes back to some of the things that we've talked about, just kind of really working to instill this culture of fiscal responsibility, both in the legislative and the executive branch. That helps by having a lot of people who are not necessarily appointed or elected, but are career civil servants who are very tightly involved in the process. So, for example, in our consensus revenue estimating group, no one on that is appointed or elected. They are career economists from our agency, from the legislature, from the Taxation Revenue Department and the Department of Transportation, right? They are all devoted their careers to that. And so I think there's a lot of confidence from both the executive and the legislative leadership, whoever they may be at the time, that they can trust those numbers, right? And they can understand and make decisions based off of that. And when they do their revenue estimates, they also do stress testing. Like, they will go out a few years and they will say, okay, what if there's a crash in the price of oil, which is obviously important for New Mexico? What happens to our budget then? What's the impact going to be? And those are numbers that I think everyone just has learned that they need to take seriously when adjusting the budget.
Thank you. Christina?
Yeah. And I'll add, not just with the content, because I think that's really important. We do that in Ohio too, but with the schedule and what needs to happen when. We have a process where we entrust that to lower level analysts, and we have committees of lower level analysts we know that will be there after the next administration, and they are charged with pushing the schedule forward. So when the guidance needs to go out, when the budget book needs to be done, they're responsible for pushing that schedule and really pushing it up to the decision makers and keeping that on time. So I think instituting the process where the revenue generating is career analysts, nonpartisan analysts, and also they drive the schedule, I think helps continuity.
Joe?
Well, I think to echo like what Andrew said, the structure in our office is has been important for the continuity in those analyst positions and the institutional knowledge that they bring forward in each new cycle, because they are not subject to an appointment by a politician like my role is, although I was in that role at one point. Some don't have any desire to aspire to my role because they don't want that type of risk. They are happy in the role as an analyst because of that assurance that they're not subject to political changes. So I think that's an important structure to provide that kind of protection against political changes to those as kind of a foundational role that ensures continuity, in each new cycle.
I think it's extremely important, the idea that the budget office has credibility, has independence, is seen as non-politicized. My experience, again, is much more at the federal government level, but you have there the Congressional Budget Office, which again is seen as independent. People may agree with them or disagree with them. They may not like the forecasts, but they don't have the perception that this is biased in one way or the other. And I think having that, it provides crucially, you are there to serve the public, you're there to serve elected officials, regardless of the administration, regardless of the party, and that can help with long-term planning. And with that, I wanted to move into issues of long-term liabilities, pensions, healthcare, debt service. How do you think about those? How do you plan for those? These are costs that are going to cross administration, cross decades. When you're thinking these longer-term liabilities, how do they play into your projections and your planning?
That's a really big question. But we have, for example, pensions. We have pension agencies. We kind of rely on them as being, the experts on projecting the liabilities for all our pension funds and stuff out into many, many years. We enacted some pretty significant pension reforms back in 2013, I believe it was, that set up our pensions, pretty good for the foreseeable future. So I think it's just leaning on the experts whose job it is to monitor those things and bring those things to the attention of, the legislature or the governor's office and say, oh, we need to, this is looking not great. We need to do something. We need to pursue some legislation that's going to fix this. Same thing with, our healthcare authority that manages Medicaid. They have a ton of experts that are always thinking about, what are the projections going to be? How do we need to adopt that out into in the budget going forward? And so that's kind of like the specific issues, and then on kind of the macro basis, then we get into the stuff I was talking about with the revenue estimating group and just projecting the big picture of revenues going forward and allowing enough. We've been fortunate in the past few years here to allow enough room between our recurring revenues and our recurring expenditures to have this kind of gap between those two that can be used for other things. Some of that could be non-recurring, kind of one-time appropriations, or it could be socked away into kind of our trust funds or our rainy day funds that help prepare for these kind of, because all the best planning on a certain issue, you never know something might come up, right? And then that way you've got those kind of funds socked away that you can tap into when you need to.
Sure, Christina?
Yeah, I think debt service is easy because we control it, right? We decide, we make the decisions about how much debt to issue, about which projects to do. So to me, that one is the easiest to project and plan forward. The things that are most challenging to us are the things we can't control, what the federal government does. And when it's challenging to plan, one of the things that we did last session was we enacted a new statute that basically clarified that federal funds support federal programs. And if the federal government decides to cease federal funding, it stops a federal program, and there's no obligation at the state level to backfill that because it's not a state program. So kind of creating that bifurcation really set the tone to have the conversation about if something happens at the federal level, how do we react? Not when something happens at the federal level, what do we do? And how do we make up for it? So it kind of changed that conversation and gave us a little bit more power and authority in our budget to weather changes over which we have no control.
Precisely. Joe, what do you think?
Well, you mentioned pensions, and pensions have been a big topic in North Dakota in recent sessions. Our pension system wasn't in crisis, but we had a system that was probably 65% funded at the low point. And so, you know, the need to address this was clear, but the path forward was not necessarily clear. It's a difficult situation, difficult to find solutions there. But some difficult choices were made where our pension fund was closed to new entrants to kind of lock in that liability and ensure it wasn't growing. And then rely on the experts, both in the pension agency and the external consultants that help value that and ensure that reasonable assumptions were being made in expected rates of return and things like that. And so a reform legislation was passed to take that unfunded liability and amortize that over a long-term period, over 30 years, have each budget process begin with an external third-party report that quantifies what that unfunded liability is based on an assumed rate of return, and a legislative commitment that was put into law to fund a portion of that each budget period. And so, you know, reliance on experts and setting up the guardrails that will guide future legislative decisions over a longer term.
Yeah, I think this makes a very important point that the decisions that the government makes today affect the welfare of the citizens and of the government for decades to come. I mean, I was originally brought on to the Oversight Board because of my background working with state and local government pensions. And when I came on, I'd look back to actuarial reports from the 1970s for the pensions here in Puerto Rico, and they said, if you don't improve your funding by so-and-so date, these pensions are going to go insolvent. And to be honest, the actuaries pegged it pretty close to the problem that we inherited at the time the Oversight Board started. But this long-term obligation, what that means is that what policymakers today have to deal with are often decisions that were made far in the past. And the decisions you make today are going to be passed on to people in the future. So having that process that really accounts for not just cash in and cash out today, but the obligations in the future is extremely important. And I totally agree on the uncertainty. Pension obligations, pension costs are uncertain. Healthcare obligations have the same way, because you can't predict how healthcare costs are going to change. So it makes this a very, very challenging kind of environment for policymakers. And I think the role that the state budget offices can play is making that challenging environment a little bit easier, of having professional staff who are regularly making those projections. So what you do, I think, it is difficult for you, but it makes the governors and the legislatures' lives much easier. Thinking about, one of the requirements for the Oversight Board to have completed its job here is for Puerto Rico to be able to return to capital markets with reasonable interest rates. What are the signals, I know you all will interact with bond rating agencies, what are the signals that they are looking for, and with the information you can provide them so that they feel confident that the debt you issue today you will be able to honor in the future, and to help keep interest rates low? What are the sorts of things that you are monitoring and thinking about? Andrew?
Sure. Well, I can speak from experience because we were fortunate that this past January, Moody's upgraded New Mexico's rating from AA2 to AA1. So in their findings as part of this, I believe they stressed our kind of stable budget and also steps that we have taken to reduce some of that revenue volatility, right? So like with Joe in North Dakota, our revenue can be volatile if it depends a lot on the price of oil and gas. So some things that we have done a few years ago, when we were basically at the peak of the Permian oil revenue boom, we passed legislation that basically capped how much of that revenue would go into the general fund. Anything in excess of that flows into a couple of different permanent trust funds that we have. So that stabilized the general fund revenue and helped to, and if you stabilize the general fund revenue, you also kind of stabilize the general fund expenditures, right? Because that has to follow on. And also, not only that, it helps provide this stable source of investment income, because now that money is it's not just sitting in the general fund, it's earning money for us. And so it has also helped us reduce our reliance on that oil and gas revenue and started to increase our interest and investment income. So that's now going to be a pretty significant, going into the future, that's going to become a much more significant part of our revenue stream, which helps reduce our reliance on the more volatile revenue sources.
Sure, Christina.
So Ohio, in the last couple of years, achieved for the first time in our history AAA credit rating from all three major credit agencies, which was a very big deal, very exciting. It's like the Super Bowl of what we do. And it was really looking at the exact criteria, and the rating agencies are not secretive about it. They tell you exactly what they look at, and as they're scoring you, they tell you exactly where you're not doing well. And we made a concerted effort to look at the metrics where we weren't doing well and compare it to states that were AAA rated, because we believed that we should be AAA rated, and really looked at what the gap was. So one of the gaps that we had is Ohio's population is aging. Well, everyone's population is aging, right? That's across the nation. So really digging into the data and where is the population aging? Do we have subcategories of populations that are growing, and how can we compare? And we really just put the information back to the rating agencies. The reserves is a big one. And in addition to the rainy day fund, the state of Ohio has always had an emergency purposes reserve, which is really a smaller dollar amount fund that's more accessible. It's easier to access. It doesn't require legislation. It requires legislative approval, but it's easier to access, and it's for real emergencies like a tornado hits a prison and you need to fix the wall. So we built that up, and we had some unique financing ways of doing that. When we received ARPA funding from the federal government, there were no restrictions on what you could do with the interest. So we took the interest and we put it into our emergency purposes fund. The rating agencies love that. Finding unique ways to satisfy the criteria that they consider that really minimizes the risk is important, and to sell that to the legislature, really making it clear to them, if we have a higher rating, it is less expensive for us to borrow. That's better for the public, that's better for you. You have a ton of priorities, you want bigger budgets. It will be cheaper if we can get a better rating. So help us do these things. And there were several changes that we made in collaboration with the legislature to help boost our credit ratings.
Joe, it's now your turn to brag.
Okay, so I've said before that the bond rating agencies have they justifiably give North Dakota some low marks on concentration of risk in our economy, in energy and agriculture. As Christina said, they're not secretive about it, right? They tell you where you rank low and where you don't. They tell you what you can do to improve, and they give us generally high marks in the areas of how we've kind of mitigated that risk through adequate reserves. We have our budget stabilization fund. We have a separate emergency response fund for disaster response. We have a separate stabilization fund for K-12 education. We have our legacy fund where we put 30% of our oil revenues to keep them out of the general fund and create more stability there. And that serves as a portion of that can serve as a reserve fund. So we get high marks in how we've put ourselves in a position with adequate reserves to mitigate some of that volatility. Also get, I think, high marks in in minimizing the use of those volatile oil revenues. Andrew talked about minimizing or limiting the amount of that flows through the general fund, and we've done that as well. And the legislature has I'll say an informal policy in one of the funds that they've created to accumulate oil revenues of only spending the kind of the cash balance in that fund for one-time purposes, and not like in our general fund, all of us, we forecast those revenues and we have a budget that's based on those forecasted revenues. In this case, with the oil revenue, because it's so volatile, we've said, let's not rely on the forecast for those. Let's wait until we have the cash in hand, and then we'll use that for one-time spending, and there's really no risk to what volatility takes place during the budget period because we're only spending the cash that we have on hand. So that's been a way where we've really minimized the budgetary risk of a volatile revenue stream and ensured that we use it for one-time things.
That's great. There are really two takeaways I took from these comments. The first is the importance of the reserve funds, of not spending everything that is available to you in a good year and save that excess to smooth over the difficulties in bad years, so that you're not constantly having to revisit your policies or your fiscal strategies for revenues because you have decided to smooth your spending and keep your reserve fund. Again, to make the household finance analogy, that's the emergency fund or the rainy day fund that every family should have. And when the government has that, it takes out some of that volatility from the planning process. But the second thing I thought was interesting was that the bond rating process is not a black box. They don't simply go into a back room and then give you a rating. They're very explicit about what it is they're looking for, and that gives policymakers targets to go for. And I think that's really, really helpful, of saying, okay, if we want to come back into the markets, these are the things we really need to accomplish. So we're running out of time here, but I'm wondering if there's any last bits of advice you would give, to the people here, to the government of Puerto Rico, about the importance or even specific steps that matter for the budget making process.
I think it's just be open and transparent as you can. Communicate with everyone what kind of the stakes are and what the investments are. Just to follow on what I talked about before with, the capping of oil and gas revenue into the general fund, like we did a few years ago. Well, now that oil is, $90 a barrel or whatever, I think there's some misinformation out there among New Mexicans who are otherwise pretty well informed about, like, well, this means unlimited revenue for the general fund now, right? Like, no, it doesn't, because we passed this legislation. And so just getting that across to everyone, and again, just involving everyone in the process, I think is key.
Sure. Christina, Joe?
One thing that I'd like to add to the conversation about reserves is, a lot of people talk about reserves as waiting for something bad to happen, plugging holes. And I would say, when I talk to people about using reserves, it's really important to understand that long term, in that using a reserve is not just plugging a hole. Reserves should be there to buy you time. When something bad happens, it buys time until you can get back in balance. If you're using, or if you want to use a reserve to do the thing that you want to do today, the problem is still going to be there that you can't afford it tomorrow. So using reserves really should be focused on how much time will this buy me until we can afford this again, until the balance is back, and not plugging a hole today.
That's really important, because government policy doesn't turn on a dime. That, as you all said before, households and businesses want stability, they want continuity, but you also understand that circumstances are going to change, and that reserve fund gives you time to make more gradual adjustments rather than changing things suddenly. Any final thoughts, Joe?
I think it's, again, important to start with a revenue outlook that's, reasonable but very conservative, where it minimizes the risk on the front end. But because, in whatever state or commonwealth we're talking about, there's always going to be risks to that revenue. It's important to have those reserve funds, have a framework in place that restores them if they're used, and also has a framework in place that it's been important in North Dakota at least to be able to adjust spending kind of midstream in a budget cycle if there is a change in the revenue forecast, so that we can minimize the use of our reserve funds and not start the next cycle with a larger budget gap because we've reduced some spending leading up to that.
Yeah, I think the emphasis on conservative assumptions is important. Sometimes the oversight board, people criticize the board projections saying these are overly conservative, but it's also important to understand that the downside is more important than the upside. In a good year, it's great if you have excess revenues, you can do some new projects. But you don't want what happens in a down year to mean you can't provide people with their health care, you can't provide children with their education. So the downside really is very, very important to protect against these worst possible outcomes, and being prudent in the assumptions you make, I think, really makes sense. Well, I want to thank you again. It's not just for this panel, but for coming down here and sharing your experience. It really, really is helpful to us on the board, and I think to the government, to the people of Puerto Rico. So thank you again for coming.
Thank you.
Thank you to our panelists and board member Andrew Biggs. Audience here at the event and at home, this is your final opportunity to propose a question for the Q&A session that will take place in just a few minutes. So please scan the QR code and submit your questions now. Our last talk presents a perspective from the Puerto Rico Office of Management and Budget. Please welcome back the Director of the OMB, Orlando Rivera Berrios, and welcome Elisa Guardiola, Budget Director at the Financial Oversight and Management Board for Puerto Rico.
Buenas tardes.
Good afternoon, and thanks for being here. I would like to thank all of those who are still here because they gave us a really hard time before lunch, and we...
Sí. Sí que para cerrar realmente...
So, to close, we need to have this conversation in order to explain what the work dynamics is between the oversight board and the management board and how it has changed, particularly in our budget cycle of 2027. So from your perspective, what do you think that marked that change from the beginning?
Well, I think I have to mention that this is the first budget that this administration did from the beginning to the end. We were able to move forward in implementing best practices in the budget preparation process, which reflected progress in how it's planned initially. I would say primarily in three elements. First place, the implementation of a budget manual, which is a central tool so that all agencies, all government agencies, have to comply in their budget requests with certain uniform criteria, justification, documentation, so that we can then evaluate in a responsible manner and identify budget risks, 2, identify whether that expense is a recurring expense or not. And then through this manual, we require all agencies that any new budget request has to be accompanied by an implementation plan where we can identify all these factors. In the second place, the implementation of the data intelligence tool. We know there's a challenge in terms of visibility in the use of expenses. And in that first year, we had to create this tool to monitor on a day-to-day basis the agency's expenses. We know we have a challenge in implementing the ERP, the new centralized financial system, but we didn't want to wait for that implementation, but we wanted to try to move it forward and have a tool to have that visibility. In the third place, I think it's the first time since the board arrived in which the Office of Management and Budget advanced the budget objectives to the government entities before the board shared with us their budget goals. That helped us to be able to advance the budget planning by around 2 months. And this is part of this collaboration and this partnership and this that we've seen with the work team, and they have given us the opportunity for us to have these initiatives.
Thank you. And I completely agree with you. I believe that the development of the manual gives it a structure, not only internally in OMB, but also in terms of communicating with the agencies to have more centralized intelligence with the integrated data system allows you to have timely data. And I believe that this is an initiative that has given you the security of having some information that perhaps you didn't have access to before. And as I said, the timing is important. You have it when you need it. And the fact that OMB got out the budget goals for us has been a key piece in what we're doing. But to me, and I would like you to share with us, what was the reaction of the agencies with all of these changes, with all of the structure that's being implemented, and with the fact that OMB itself is establishing what the goals are?
It was positive to have moved planning forward by us issuing the budget goals for 2027. This marked and defined the fact that the Office of Management and Budget can organize in a timely fashion the proposals of the various agencies in their budget requests and be able to justify those needs. There's a challenge, and part of the budget reform that we're seeking to implement, that we're working with jointly, is not just to reinforce the Office of Management and Budget. We have a challenge of reinforcing the budget offices of all government agencies. While we reinforce those offices, the budget requests will then be more efficient and will be able to be evaluated more timely and efficiently by the OMB. I think that the greatest challenge at the Office of Management and Budget is how do we educate the agencies and get them to understand the resources that are available and what are the revenues and projections, so that they don't just know at the central level in our office, so that they understand them, and for them to know that this is the resource that we have, and how do we align to, based on those resources, be able to execute public policy and the government's plan.
And this is what we talked about, that term, adequate. And I believe that, as the speakers have mentioned before, there's always competing needs. There's always going to be a dynamic by which not everybody is totally in agreement. And I believe that that term adequate gives you the perspective to explain to the agencies that the goals that you establish not only think about the agencies, but also the government.
And part of the tool that we were able to implement has helped us to be able to present to the agencies that the budget goal is based on the available resources, and according to the data, we believe that the assigned budget is the adequate, it's the appropriate one. I think that this communication, this education, has to be taken to all of the agencies, and we acknowledge that we need to improve the legal framework of the OMB in order to be able to have that access to all the agencies. We have entities that have their own independent enabling law, and we don't have access that the FOMB currently has.
Well, on the other hand, I want to confess to you that we have changed our internal dynamics in terms of how we do things, because you have presented to us some goals and have discussed it with the agencies. So we have changed our focus. Also, you have our support because the collaboration started in August, where we had weekly sessions with the working teams. And I would like to truly thank you, because you made the working groups part of the sessions, and that working group who's here today is fully committed to participating in those sessions. So now, having given you the context, do you understand, or do you believe that this focus and collaboration strengthens institutional capabilities of OMB beyond this cycle?
Definitely. Everything that has been implemented, the budget manual and the tool for data intelligence, this is part of creating a permanent something, and for it to be long-term, we have to continue to reinforce the organizational structure of the Office of Management, but we have to look for that necessary legal framework so that it would be permanent legally. But before we reach that process of the legal framework, which will be submitted at the appropriate time, we are already implementing procedures, norms, guidelines, manuals to create that foundation. And so the new structure that has been created at the OMB office, which is directed towards all macroeconomic and revenue projections in collaboration to all the work that we're doing with you, it's the beginning of that budget reform which we want to establish on a permanent basis in the Puerto Rico government.
Well, and in closing, well, I want to say that, first of all, for us, and I have said this before, it has been very pleasant and pleasurable that you have given us the opportunity to continue collaborating. And all of the panelists have emphasized that there should be collaboration with both the executive and legislative branches. So obviously, this cycle is being led by the Office of Management and Budget, and we are advising you, making sure that you implement the best practices, that the recommendations that you are giving are based on data and analysis. So if you had to summarize in one sentence what 2027 means in terms of the process.
Considering that the 2026 budget, which is one which we did in collaboration and was certified by the FOMB, and take into consideration that it wasn't just certified initially by the board, but based on all the tools which we have implemented, we're making sure that it concludes in a balanced manner. I think that's important. Taking all of that in consideration, I think that the 2027 budget, we've had the opportunity to work from beginning to end, is a much more robust precedent with a better data analysis, and it's a strategic budget which deals with both uncertainties, fiscal risks, as well as to be able to fulfill the government's plan and our governor's public policy. So I have no doubt that it's going to be a better prepared budget than the one was in 2026.
Well, finally, I want to thank you all. We still have a long road ahead.
Yes, we have a meeting between 4 to 6 to work on the budgets. Thank you very much.
So thank you and good afternoon. Thank you, Elisa and Orlando.
All of the panelists will be participating, as well as the Oversight Board members and director. While we set up the stage for them all, please remain seated. This will only take a moment. We have received several interesting questions, so thank you to everyone who submitted questions here at the event and from home during our live stream. Now please welcome back all of our panelists, Oversight Board members, and Director. Shelby Kearns will moderate this Q&A session.
Sorry.
So thank you all for submitting some interesting questions. And I'm going to go ahead and direct these to various panel members up here today. And we're going to start with Juan Carlos. First question is, how can budget transformation built on the practices we have and improve these instead of erasing everything and writing a new script? So instead of starting over, how would we build on what we have?
That is a really good question, because sometimes we're really hard on ourselves and we only look at the bad things, but only look at the positive things that have been worked on. And there's a lot of work that has been done by the government of Puerto Rico and by the board. There's also a lot of tradition of how Puerto Rico did things. Not everything was bad, not everything was, misinformed, and we need to find those practices, find those customs, and build on them. I think fiscal transformation is not throwing away everything that we have done, but it's building and learning, having this conversation, looking at these experiences, and learning from others. I'm a strong believer in peer learning, and we have some of our peers here, and I'm sure that this conversation will continue, and we need to incorporate that information, those learnings, to our local context and to our history and to what we know. We know better than anyone what has worked in Puerto Rico and what hasn't, because we have lived it. And from that foundation is how we build this transformation. So I think it's necessary to bring new practices, to bring that modernization to our budget system. But at the same time, we have to do it well aware of where we come from and how we did things in the past.
It's a great answer. And it's true that all states are regularly updating their budget statutes, adding things into code, modernizing, as you said. So that's also a standard practice. Christina, from an execution standpoint, have you found it more effective to centralize functions like procurement, HR, treasury, and IT under budget authority, or keep them independent? And how does that impact your ability to control spending and implement reforms?
Well, I will say, so we have a Department of Administrative Services that really it manages IT and procurement. That is not in the budget office. However, we control all the spending. So while agencies have to, break their budgets down into a granular level of, as I mentioned before, payroll and supplies and equipment and subsidy, the actual process of procurement and the process of IT and IT projects are managed by another agency. So they have to afford it first. So we have all of the process in place such that an agency can't get too far into a project and not be able to afford it. So we have the controls in place, but another agency manages the technical aspects of that.
And I would imagine you work very closely with them.
Very closely, yes.
For Andrew Miner, Dr. Miner, we have two Andrews up here. How do you operationally integrate federal funds into your core budgeting process? Are they built into base budgets, tracked separately, or tied to performance metrics? And how do you prevent them from distorting state priorities? Great question.
Very good question. So almost kind of all of the above, really. So federal funds are integrated into the operating budget. They are one of the four broad categories of revenue. New Mexico, and New Mexico, as I kind of mentioned, pretty large receiver of federal funds. Our general fund budget for 27 is about $11 billion, and our federal funds budget, I think, is 12 or 13. Most of that is Medicaid. We're a big Medicaid state, so all of that has to be integrated into operating budgets. They appear in the budget bill, but the big kind of exception with them is that agencies have pretty much unlimited authority to adjust their federal funds budget during the fiscal year. That could be either because they got a new grant and so they need to budget that, they need to establish budget for that, or they need to, some federal funding went away because there were federal budget cuts or whatever, and so they need to reduce their budget accordingly. So it's very important that agencies keep track of all those different federal funding sources, and if they're big agencies, they might have, like our environment department has dozens of different environmental related grants that they have to keep track of and work with us to adjust their budgets accordingly. Beyond the operating budget, there's some that gets budgeted kind of like in one-time separate pots. So like for FEMA money, we had a few pretty horrible fires in New Mexico, forest fires in New Mexico a few years ago. So we're still dealing with, kind of the federal money and the federal response to those. So they get tracked a little bit separately because they're different kind of pots from your kind of annual operating budget. So in terms of performance measures, the performance measures are going to be kind of like tied. They're more tied programmatically. A lot of them aren't really tied to funding source unless it's kind of just through happenstance. But of course, there are a bunch of Medicaid-related performance measures, right? And Medicaid is about 28% general funds, 70% federal funds, or something like that. So they are involved in that way.
Great. I'm so glad somebody asked this question because it's a constant topic among budget directors. So I'll ask this one of you, Sophia. Do you have any tips about how to keep government budget employees motivated and keep them in public service?
Ooh, that's a tough one. I think it's really important. We recently launched an initiative called the GRIT Initiative, Government Reform, Innovation, and Technology. When the DOGE efforts came out, and we wanted to send the message that state employees are our partner, and that if we're going to accomplish something, it's the people on the front lines who are doing the work that we want to partner with to make sure we're doing things efficiently. So we challenged all of our agencies to take part in this GRIT initiative and come forward with ideas on how to make government more efficient. This is one example of what we do to try to elevate the status of public service and to really see this as an opportunity for public service. This is something that we're doing for the benefit of the people, and it's an opportunity to do something bigger than yourself and to contribute to something bigger than yourself. And so we share and sell that as well for the opportunity to come and make great things happen for the state of Utah.
So true. We talk about it's all about these places that we love. Robert, a question for you. Why is there so much discussion about modified accrual so that the board can complete its mandate in Puerto Rico, and why is it important?
Well, first on the PROMESA specifically mentions 4 consecutive balanced budgets. We've had balanced budgets in Puerto Rico, but we haven't had them under the modified accrual standard that's in PROMESA. And it's more than an accounting treatment. It is a way to make the government more accountable for its spending. And the reason it's important, I live with it partially in New York State. New York State is on a cash accounting system. New York City is on a modified accrual system. New York City, they were rewarded with the modified accrual system after the bankruptcy in the 1970s. And the reason you use modified accrual system, just a simple way of thinking about it, is it requires you to have the revenues for the spending in that year to be aligned. So you have to have the revenues that come in one year, you have to align it with the spending from that year. Why that's important is because on a cash accounting system, you can play a lot of gimmicks. And when there are difficult times, or sometimes not so difficult times, you just move expenditures from one year to another, delay paying a bill, delay paying large amounts of bills, move them into another fiscal year, and then you show like your budget was balanced in 1 year, but what you really did was you just shifted payments into another year. That's a practice that in Puerto Rico they did for years. So it made it seem on a cash basis that the budgets were balanced. And I remember having this conversation with previous administrations here in Puerto Rico when they said, well, our budgets were always balanced. But when you looked at the audited financial statements, they showed that the budgets were not balanced for 16 consecutive years. Every year, they played the game of shifting expenses from one year into the next, and then into the next, and then into the next, until eventually, right, you fell off the cliff. So, not being in the room when they drafted Promesa, but in talking to people, that was important because they did not want that to happen again. And they wanted the discipline of the modified accrual standard to be a requirement. And it's not that hard, right? And there are exceptions. It's called modified accrual because there are exceptions. Things like, capital spending, things that cross years. Those obviously don't have to be paid for in each year. But that's the reason it's important, and it's very much achievable here because we have the resources. What we need is the systems in place to align the revenues and know what spending you have in any given year and know what's spent. Now, I know New Mexico is here, they're actually are using the modified accrual system, so you have more experience with it. But it's important for Puerto Rico not to return to the practices of the past. And it's very doable. And like I said, New York City's been doing it since the 1970s. It works. And they still, you can run into budget challenges with that, but it requires a discipline and an amount of disclosure publicly that heretofore they didn't have. And the practices that was part of the failures that resulted in the bankruptcy.
Thank you, and that perfectly actually sets up next question that I'll direct to you, Alexis. Should a construction project be budgeted in a particular fiscal year, even though the project will take multiple years, or should it be budgeted in each fiscal year based on the project completion estimates?
Thank you for that question. So what we do in Illinois that I think works pretty well is we try to provide an appropriation that assumes the full cost of the project up front for transparency. We may expect for a building construction project that we'll only spend 5 to 10% in the first year for design. But we would appropriate the full cost, say it's $100 million, whatever's unspent at the end of the fiscal year, we then roll that forward. And I think that provides understanding to the general public of how much the project costs, but then it also makes a commitment of the revenues in future years to finishing the project.
Thank you. I'm going to address this one to you, Joe, but if anybody else wants to chime in as well as about what this is a looking forward question, so if you have things that you're looking at in your state. How are your governments preparing for the potential changes Congress and the administration have signaled about the level of future federal disaster assistance?
Sorry, is that
me? Sorry? Oh, to Joe, I'm sorry. Yeah.
Well, okay, that's a good question. We, we do have reserve funds that we maintain just for the purpose of disaster response, and so I guess in terms of planning for different contingencies there, including federal participation, we feel like maintaining that reserve fund is kind of our insurance against those uncertainties.
So maybe I can jump in as well. So we have rainy day funds. We actually have rainy day accounts for each specific major revenue type. So we have a rainy day fund for our general fund, rainy day fund for our income tax. We have one for Medicaid stabilization in the event something happens with stabilization where we're pulling in revenue there. And then we have a revenue account for our disaster recovery. And our disaster recovery, we have fire, flooding, and earthquakes are the major risk factor for Utah. We have a goal, a statutory limit to try to build that up to 70 million. We've set aside some ongoing funding to help build that up over time, $10 million every year to help build up that account. And then anything extra will go to some of these other disaster recovery funds. But that's what we're trying to do to make sure we're able to be resilient in the event that we end up not being able to get FEMA assistance or anything like that. We've also self-insured for earthquakes. Earthquake insurance is very, very expensive. We've set up our own captive to try to also be able to be able to mitigate that risk. So that, in addition to our about 13% of our state funds are set aside now in our rainy day funds in the event something major happens.
Does anyone else have any insights on how you're approaching that? A couple of the things that we've heard at NASBO from states as well is they're looking at, the mitigation and preparedness. That's money that they're very concerned about. So trying to free up funds in case they need to probably take over some of those positions that are very integral to their states, and preserving some of their bonding authority so they can borrow should they not be able to have reserves. Right now, no one's quite sure what the future of FEMA assistance looks like, so everyone's just trying to be as prepared as possible and add flexibility into their budgets. Those are all of the questions that we had submitted. I thank you all for those. Those are wonderful things for us to have added into the discussion. And I just want to say from a personal perspective, just take a moment to thank you all for your time. It's such an honor for us to be able to be here, for everyone to be able to come from their states and talk about a profession and that they're so passionate about. As I think you can tell, we were able to see some lovely friends from the Puerto Rico Budget Office and also make some new friends. So it's been wonderful to be here, and we thank you all so much for the invitation.
In closing, we'll hear some final remarks from Oversight Board's Executive Director, Robert Mojica.
Again, thank you. And as we close today's symposium, I want to thank our speakers, our moderators, and everyone that joined us today in the room and through the live stream. Today's discussion made one thing clear, that meaningful reform depends on strong institutions, reliable data, and sustained collaboration. And Puerto Rico is building all three. What stayed with me from today's panels was the consistency of the message. Across 5 budget directors, 5 different states, 5 different political environments, every one of them came back to the same point, that the reforms that lasted were the ones that are written into law, that had statutory frameworks and executive commitments, but you need both. These are the ones that matter. The reserves that protected their states during downturns were established by statute, with mandatory deposit rules and clear withdrawal criteria. The multi-year financial plans that gave their governments credibility to the markets were required by law. The forecasting processes that prevented optimistic revenue forecasts and bias that drove Puerto Rico's crisis were codified in statute. And John Nixon proved that in Michigan, even from the deep fiscal hole that they were in, those reforms can be built, and they help. So those are practitioners who have lived through political transitions, telling Puerto Rico what they learned the hard way. If it is not in the law, it is not permanent. Christina Frass from Ohio made another point that resonated and that is particularly relevant right now. Ohio has built a disciplined process as it relates to analyzing the fiscal impact of tax law changes. And they did that before the laws are enacted. The analysis comes first before the decisions are made about tax relief, so that they're made clear about what the impacts are over the long term and what's the state's capacity to absorb it. That is the standard Puerto Rico should hold to itself, not as a barrier to providing relief, but as a responsible way to make sure that the relief is sustainable over time. The need for these reforms is not a new idea for Puerto Rico. It has been discussed and documented for years. What is new is that we are at the moment where it must actually get done for the future of Puerto Rico. And Puerto Rico can do this. So what's next? Today we discussed the building blocks. Now we build. Now we have to build a budget process that protects Puerto Rico's fiscal stability and completes the recovery from the fiscal crisis so that Puerto Rico never falls into the bankruptcy again. We saw today in the conversation between the Budget Director Orlando Rivera Berrios and Elisa Guardiola that this work is already beginning. A budget manual that sets the uniform standards across the agencies, a daily spending monitoring system, and for the first time, OMB is sending budget targets to the agencies before receiving the board's targets. These are real changes that are already underway. The work of building is not waiting for this symposium to end. It has already started. And now we have to create the legal framework, the foundation for which this budget process will rest permanently. Reserves must be established in law with mandatory deposit rules, clear withdrawal criteria, and legislative protections. And I heard from one of the budget directors also spoke that, reserves are just a means to temporarily hold you until you can make the tough decisions. They are not there so that you don't have to make the tough decisions. And I think that is the discipline that needs to be learned, because you need to set the money aside so that you have time to do what needs to get done to put things back in the balance. And I think that's a really good lesson. Long-term financial plans must be codified into law, capital plans, and an all-funds budget. All of this needs to be incorporated into the statutory framework for Puerto Rico to ensure that the rules and the guardrails do not change by administration, government to government. There needs to be continuity. These are the core principles. They're not political priorities. Every administration will have political priorities, but they must rest on these core budgeting principles. The Oversight Board's role under PROMESA is to ensure that governance decisions are consistent with the path to fiscal responsibility and the path to market access. But the board does not want to be here forever, and the fastest way to end the Oversight Board is to institutionalize the reforms. I want to acknowledge Governor Gonzalez-Colón directly. The reforms that we are discussing today require executive leadership. And her presence here and her administration's engagement in the process reflects the kind of commitment that makes the reforms real. And we look forward to working with the legislature because the statutory framework requires both branches of government. These are not board priorities being imposed on Puerto Rico. They are the standards that every state represented in this room already meets. Our goals are the same. What we heard today shows that they are goals and standards that other jurisdictions share too, and that they can be done right with reserves built, capital plans made and funded, and a credible plan in place. Puerto Rico will be able to show the world that it has changed. So I want to thank the government, the legislature, NASBO, all of the fiscal staffs, the nonprofit organizations, and the business community for their support in making today possible. And we remain committed to continuing this dialogue as part of a shared responsibility for Puerto Rico's future. Puerto Rico has done the hard work of getting here. Now let's build what comes next. Thank you. Thank you.